The moment it happens is smaller than you expect. There is no thunder, no warning, just a sentence, sometimes barely that. A look, a tone, something that implies fault without stating it. And inside you, something primitive flares awake before your mind can even name it. Your body moves first. Heat rises in the chest. Breath shortens. The mouth prepares itself as if it has a duty, not to dominate, not to observe, but to respond. That is where it ends. Not later, not after the argument unfolds, but right there, in the split second where your mouth opens to correct a reality that never needed your permission. That opening is the loss. Everything after is decoration. You believe the danger is the accusation itself. It is not. Accusations are common, cheap, almost recreational. What matters is what you do when one lands. The world is not watching to see whether you are right. It is watching to see whether you react as someone who must be right. Those two positions are not the same. One implies stability. The other implies fear. Fear has a smell. It leaks through the smallest things. A rushed sentence. A higher pitch. Too many details delivered too quickly. The subtle pleading hidden inside clarification. None of this is conscious. That is what makes it fatal. When you speak under pressure, your body betrays your status before your words can defend it. The rhythm gives you away. The need to be precise gives you away. The urgency to explain tells everyone present that something important is at stake for you, and whatever is important to you can be used against you. This is not philosophy, this is observation. People do not dominate by being cruel. They dominate by noticing where tension lives and touching it lightly. Your explanation tells them exactly where to press. Hierarchy does not announce itself. It is decided silently. In moments like this, one person speaks as if they must justify their existence in the room. The other listens as if they are entitled to judge it. From that instant, the roles are set. You can reverse many things in life. This is not one of them. Once you explain, you have agreed to the premise that you are being evaluated. You may believe you are correcting an error. What you are actually doing is accepting a lower position in an invisible structure that now governs the interaction. Notice how fast this happens. The accusation can be absurd, it can be vague, it can even be wrong. None of that matters. What matters is that your body reacts as if survival depends on being understood. That reaction was trained into you long before this moment. It does not belong to the present. It belongs to an earlier time, when misunderstanding carried consequences. Your nervous system does not distinguish between a raised eyebrow now and a raised voice then. It only knows threat. And under threat, it chooses the behavior that once reduced pain. Explanation, clarification, pleading dressed up as reason. The world exploits this reflex because it is reliable. You can see it everywhere once you know what to look for. The person who talks too much in meetings, the partner who over-explains texts, the employee who preemptively defends decisions no one has challenged yet. Each one believes they are being transparent. Each one is quietly teaching others how to treat them. Transparency offered without demand is not honesty, it is exposure. And exposure without power is vulnerability disguised as virtue. Truth has never protected anyone who delivered it from below. Truth does not float freely in the air, waiting to be recognized. It is weighed by the posture of the person who carries it. When your tone asks for acceptance, your words are heard as a request, not a statement. Requests invite judgment. Statements create gravity. The difference is not what you say, it is whether you appear willing to stand alone with it. Explanation signals that you are not. There is a particular humiliation in realizing this after the fact. You replay the moment and hear yourself talking. You remember how fast you spoke, how carefully you tried to be fair, how much you wanted to be seen as reasonable. Reasonable is the mask of the subordinate. It is worn by those who cannot afford to be misinterpreted. Power does not rush to fix misunderstandings. Power lets them exist and observes who becomes uncomfortable first. The most dangerous part is how natural it feels. Explaining feels like relief, like exhaling after holding your breath. That relief is the release of tension you should have kept. The tension was doing work for you. It was pressing outward. The moment you spoke, you took it back into yourself. You collapsed the pressure field and handed control to the other person. They did not need to say anything else. Your reaction told them everything they needed to know. This is why the loss feels subtle but permanent. No one claps. No one declares victory. The room simply adjusts. People lean back slightly. Eyes change. The invisible weight shifts away from you. From that point on, your words have less density. You can speak again later more calmly, more clearly, and it will not restore what was given away. The decision has already been made at a level beneath language. You may tell yourself that staying silent would have been awkward, that it would have made things worse, that you would have seemed guilty. These thoughts are part of the same reflex. Guilt is not what silence creates. Silence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is intolerable to those who rely on control. The fear of seeming guilty is the fear of being judged. That fear already places you below the person you imagine judging you. You do not escape that position by speaking. You confirm it. The first time you notice this pattern clearly, it is unsettling, not because of what others have done to you, but because of what you have done to yourself repeatedly, without noticing. Each explanation was a small training session. Each defense was rehearsal. Over time, people learned that pressure produces speech from you, that implication produces effort, that you will work to repair frames you did not create. Once that lesson is learned, it is rarely forgotten. The loss is not loud. It is quiet. It sounds like your own voice filling the space too quickly. It ends with the other person saying very little. And afterward, when the air settles, you feel something you cannot name yet. A sense that something has shifted and will not shift back. The body reacts before the mind has any chance to intervene. That is the part most people never forgive themselves for, because it exposes how little control they actually have. An accusation does not arrive as language first. It arrives as chemistry. The sentence is almost irrelevant. What matters is the signal beneath it. A hint of disapproval, a suggestion of fault, the implication that your standing is under review. The moment that signal is detected, your nervous system makes a decision without asking you. Blood shifts, muscles tighten, breathing changes. Cortisol floods the bloodstream, sharp and fast, like a switch being thrown. This is not metaphor, it is mechanical. And once it begins, speech is no longer a choice. It is a reflex. Cortisol exists for one purpose: to prepare you to survive judgment, not debate it, not analyze it, survive it. In environments where misunderstanding once meant punishment, survival required explanation, fast explanation, precise explanation, the kind that tried to preempt anger before it could land. Your body learned this long before it learned language. That is why, when accused, you feel compelled to speak even if you know better. The compulsion does not come from logic. It comes from a system that believes silence equals danger. This is why the mouth opens before the thought forms. The explanation begins halfway through a breath you did not choose. You may even hear yourself talking and wonder why you cannot stop. The words keep coming because the body believes the threat is active. Cortisol does not wait for evidence. It reacts to possibility. It assumes the worst and demands immediate action. That action is submission disguised as cooperation. The goal is not to win. The goal is to reduce perceived threat by appeasing the figure who triggered it. Appeasement has a sound. It sounds like speed. It sounds like overclarity. It sounds like someone trying to close a gap that was never opened. When cortisol drives speech, you explain not only what happened, but why it happened, and why it makes sense, and why you are not the kind of person who would intend harm. Intent is always mentioned early. That alone reveals everything. People with power do not rush to declare their intent. They assume it is irrelevant. Only those who fear misinterpretation feel the need to state it. The irony is cruel. The more cortisol you have, the more convincing your explanation feels to you. The urgency feels justified. The details feel necessary. Inside your body it feels like clarity. Outside your body it looks like panic. Listeners do not hear your words as information. They hear them as movement. Movement away from pressure. Movement towards safety. Movement always implies that the current position is unsafe. By moving verbally, you announce that you are not stable where you stand. There is a particular tightening in the chest that comes with this. A sense that if you do not speak now, something irreversible will happen. That sense is false. What is irreversible is what happens when you do speak. Cortisol narrows attention. It reduces your awareness to the perceived threat and erases context. You stop seeing the room. You stop reading faces. You stop noticing who actually holds power and who is simply posturing. All you see is the need to correct the narrative immediately. That narrowing is not focus. It is blindness. Under cortisol, you give away more than words. You give away timing. You respond too quickly. Speed becomes your tell. The faster you answer, the more you confirm that the accusation mattered. Silence would have forced the other person to hold their own implication in the open. Speech allows them to retreat into listening. Listening from above, evaluating, measuring, deciding whether your explanation is sufficient. You have handed them that position biologically, not socially. This is why people often regret what they said under accusation, even when the content was accurate. Accuracy does not undo posture. The body language of defense contaminates the truth it carries. A calm lie can dominate a frantic fact. Cortisol ensures that your delivery undermines your correctness. Your voice betrays you by trying to be understood. Understanding is not neutral. It is something you seek from those you believe outrank you. Notice how the body settles only after you finish explaining. There is a brief drop in tension, a false sense of relief. You think the danger has passed. In reality, you have simply completed the ritual your nervous system demanded. The other person may even nod. They may say nothing at all. That silence feels like resolution. It is not. It is assessment. They are not absorbing your explanation. They are absorbing your reaction. And reactions, once observed, become predictable. From that moment on, your cortisol becomes a lever. The person who triggered it may not even know they did, but their body registers the effect. Humans are exquisitely sensitive to shifts in status, even when they cannot articulate them. They sense when someone collapses inward. They sense when someone rushes to restore equilibrium. They learn without thinking that pressure works on you. That implication makes you move. That silence from them produces speech from you. This is how dominance trains itself, without intention. No one needs to be cruel. They only need to watch what you do when you feel judged. Cortisol makes sure you perform the same way each time unless you interrupt it. Most people never do. They live their entire lives governed by a chemical that mistakes social discomfort for mortal danger. They call it being reasonable. They call it being communicative. They call it being mature. But the body knows what it is. It is fear rehearsed so many times it feels like personality. The danger is not that cortisol exists. The danger is that it speaks through you while pretending to be you. When you explain yourself under accusation, it is not your voice that is heard first. It is the sound of a system trying to survive judgment. That sound lingers long after the words fade. Thought does not lead this process. That is the most unsettling realization. You like to believe that when you speak, it is because you have decided to, that you weighed options, chose clarity, chose honesty. In the moment of accusation, none of that happens. The sequence is already in motion before awareness arrives. By the time your mind shows up, your body has committed. The words forming in your mouth are not ideas. They are discharge, pressure seeking release. Cortisol does not ask what is true. It asks what will end the threat fastest. Speed matters more than precision. Sound matters more than meaning. This is why your explanations often come out tangled, slightly off, too much. You say things you did not intend to say. You reveal angles you never planned to reveal. You volunteer context that no one requested. Afterwards you tell yourself you were just being thorough. But thoroughness under threat is not competence. It is leakage. Watch the timing closely. The accusation lands. There is a fraction of a second where silence could exist. That is the hinge point. That pause is where hierarchy could remain undecided. Cortisol cannot tolerate that pause. It interprets stillness as exposure, exposure as danger, so it fills the gap for you. The mouth opens because the body believes that noise equals safety, that any sound is better than the risk of being looked at without defense. This is why explanations under pressure feel rushed even when the speaker tries to slow down. The urgency is not mental, it is physiological. Cortisol accelerates pacing, it shortens breath, it raises pitch, it sharpens consonants. Even if you consciously lower your voice, the underlying rhythm gives you away. Rhythm is harder to fake than words. People trust rhythm. They sense when it comes from calm and when it comes from alarm. The body is honest even when the mind lies. You may think you sound reasonable. Others hear strain. You may think you sound confident. Others hear justification. The gap between intention and reception widens precisely when you need it to narrow. This is why explaining never works the way you expect it to. You are trying to transmit meaning through a channel that has already been hijacked by fear. Cortisol also distorts perception. It magnifies the importance of the accuser. In that moment, their opinion feels heavier than it is. Their tone feels more authoritative than it is. A casual remark can feel like an indictment. A mild question can feel like an attack. The chemical does this deliberately. It inflates the threat so that submission seems rational. When you explain, you are not responding to the person in front of you. You are responding to an internal image of authority projected onto them. That projection is dangerous because it upgrades ordinary people into judges. It gives them power they did not claim and may not even want. But once you behave as if they have it, the upgrade becomes real. Power does not require intention to function. It only requires acceptance. Cortisol ensures acceptance happens instantly, without debate. Notice how explanation often starts before the accusation finishes. You interrupt, you jump in, you preempt. That is cortisol anticipating punishment. It has learned that delay increases risk, so it cuts in early. The interruption itself is revealing. It signals that you are not listening. You are managing damage. Damage control is not neutral. It assumes loss has already occurred, and assumptions, once visible, shape outcomes. This is why calm people appear slow in these moments. Not because they are dull, but because nothing inside them is rushing. Their bodies do not interpret the situation as a threat. They can afford to wait. Waiting looks like confidence because it is confidence. Not performative confidence, but chemical confidence. Their nervous system is not screaming for relief, so they do not speak to relieve themselves. They speak, if they speak at all, because they choose to. The most humiliating part is how predictable this makes you. Once someone has seen you explain under pressure, they know exactly how to move you. They do not need to accuse directly. A raised eyebrow will do. A pause, a vague statement left hanging. Cortisol will rush in to complete the pattern. You will supply the rest. You will clarify. You will defend. You will do the work for them. They can lean back and watch. You might believe this only happens in high-stakes situations. It does not. It happens in small ones, because the body does not measure stakes accurately. It measures familiarity. Anything that resembles past judgment triggers the same cascade. A partner's silence, a colleague's tone, a stranger's comment. Each one lights the same fuse, and each time you speak reflexively, you reinforce the circuit. The body learns that explanation follows threat. The reflex tightens. This is why people who explain a lot often feel exhausted without knowing why. They are constantly discharging tension that never needed to be taken in. They live in a state of low-grade cortisol activation, always half preparing to justify themselves. They mistake this vigilance for responsibility. In reality, it is captivity. They are not managing reality. They are managing fear of being seen incorrectly. The truth that most people never face is this: the urge to explain is not a sign of integrity. It is a sign of unresolved threat conditioning. It is the sound of a system that never learned it was allowed to remain silent. And until that system is confronted, it will keep speaking for you at the exact moments where speech costs the most. The loss does not come from saying the wrong thing. It comes from revealing that something inside you cannot tolerate being misunderstood. That intolerance is visible, and once it is visible, it becomes a handle. Desperation is not loud. That is the mistake people make. They imagine it as begging or raised voices or emotional collapse. Real desperation is quieter. It hides inside polish. It disguises itself as reasonableness. It lives in the subtle acceleration of speech, the way sentences stack too quickly, the way explanations arrive before they are requested. It lives in the effort to sound calm while moving too fast. That effort is visible. It is felt even when it is not named. Tone is not decoration. Tone is information. It tells the listener how much this moment matters to you. When you speak under accusation, your tone does something you cannot stop. It leans forward. It reaches. It tries to close distance. That reaching is the leak. Power never reaches. It occupies. The moment your tone seeks understanding, approval or resolution, it announces that something is at risk for you. And whatever is at risk can be threatened again. People believe their words carry the meaning. They do not. Delivery does. A calm sentence delivered from stability lands as fact. The same sentence delivered from urgency lands as defense. You can say the exact same thing and invert its effect entirely depending on how fast you say it and how much you seem to need it to land. Needing is the poison. The listener does not analyze content first. They feel posture first. Posture decides interpretation before meaning ever arrives. Pacing is where the truth escapes. When you are steady, time stretches. You allow space between thoughts. You let silence sit without rushing to fill it. When you are desperate, time compresses. You hurry as if something might close if you do not get through the sentence quickly enough. That hurry suggests fragility. It suggests that your position cannot withstand scrutiny. Even if that suggestion is false, it is now present, and presence is all that matters. The world is not fair in how it interprets this. It does not care that your urgency comes from a desire to be accurate. It does not care that you are trying to prevent misunderstanding. All it sees is someone working hard to manage perception. Work signals weakness. Effort signals imbalance. Those who are secure do not labor to be seen correctly. They assume reality will hold without their intervention. That assumption reads as strength, whether it is deserved or not. There is a particular way people nod when they hear desperation. It is almost imperceptible. A slight tilt. A pause before responding. Sometimes no response at all. That nod is not agreement. It is registration. They have learned something about you. They have learned that you care. They have learned where your nerves are exposed. They may never consciously use this knowledge. They do not have to. It will guide their behavior automatically from then on. This is why truth loses when delivered poorly. It is not punished for being false. It is punished for arriving from below. The listener feels invited to weigh it, to judge it, to accept or reject it. That invitation was issued by your delivery, not your words. Once invited, people step into the role naturally. Humans are comfortable judging when given permission. Your tone gives it to them without asking. Desperation also creates asymmetry. You speak a lot. They speak little. You fill the air. They conserve energy. Conservation reads as control. Expenditure reads as need. Even if they are wrong, even if they are confused, even if they are bluffing, your effort makes them appear composed by comparison. They can afford to wait because you are doing the work. Waiting looks like confidence. Silence looks like superiority. You have built that illusion for them. Notice how often explanations include emotional disclaimers, phrases that try to manage how the words will be received, softening language, clarifying intent, anticipating objections. These disclaimers are not neutral. They announce anxiety about reaction. Anxiety is contagious in the wrong direction. It lowers the perceived value of what follows. The listener hears not only what you are saying, but what you are afraid they might think. That fear colors everything. The cruel part is that the more intelligent you are, the worse this can become. Intelligence provides more words, more nuance, more context. Under pressure, all of it spills out. You overwhelm the space with competence performed from insecurity. To an observer, this does not look like mastery. It looks like someone trying to secure their footing on unstable ground. The ground may be stable, your movement suggests otherwise. People rarely remember what you explained in these moments. Ask them later. They will not recall the details. They will recall how you sounded. They will recall whether you seemed sure or strained, whether you paused or rushed, whether you held the space or tried to win it. Memory favors posture over content. That is why explanations fade while impressions harden. Once desperation leaks, it cannot be gathered back. You cannot say, later, in a calmer tone, what you should have said then. The earlier leak has already shaped the frame. Later calmness looks like recovery, not authority. Recovery is still movement. Authority does not recover. It was never threatened in the first place. This is how people lose ground without realizing it. Not through lies told about them, but through truths delivered from a shrinking position. They believed they were misunderstood. In reality, they were understood perfectly. Their delivery said more than their words ever could. And after the moment passes, there is a quiet residue, a sense that something tightened around you, that the space feels slightly smaller than before. No one points it out. No one needs to. The frame has adjusted. You feel it in how carefully you choose your next words, even when no one is accusing you of anything at all. Truth does not enter the room naked. It arrives dressed in the posture of the one carrying it. This is what most people never understand, and why they keep losing while believing they are right. The world does not weigh facts on a scale. It measures them through delivery. How something is said decides what it becomes. A true statement spoken from tension becomes a plea. The same statement spoken from stillness becomes a verdict. The difference is not moral, it is mechanical. People like to believe that clarity wins, that if they explain carefully enough, reality will assert itself. This belief is comforting because it absolves them of responsibility for how they are perceived. It allows them to say silently that if others misunderstand, it is not their fault. But perception does not care about fairness. It responds to cues, and the strongest cue of all is how much effort you put into being believed. When you explain yourself, you are not presenting truth. You are performing concern about how truth will be received. That concern is louder than the content. Listeners feel it immediately. They may not be able to articulate it, but their nervous systems register it. Someone is trying to convince me. Someone is invested in my agreement. Someone needs this to land. Those impressions arrive before any logical evaluation occurs. Once they arrive, they filter everything that follows. This is why two people can say the same thing and produce opposite effects. One states a fact and leaves it there. The other states the same fact and leans forward, watches faces, adjusts tone mid-sentence. The first sounds solid, even if they are wrong. The second sounds uncertain, even if they are right. Certainty is not produced by accuracy, it is produced by the absence of need. Delivery exposes need in ways words cannot hide. The micro-adjustments give it away. The slight smile meant to soften impact. The added sentence meant to prevent offense. The quick follow-up meant to close a gap that no one opened. Each adjustment signals awareness of judgment. Awareness of judgment signals hierarchy. You do not manage the reactions of those you consider beneath you. You only manage the reactions of those you believe can affect you. This is why truth loses under defense. Defense reframes truth as a position rather than a reality. Positions are debated. Reality stands. The moment you defend, you turn what is into something that must be justified. Justification invites comparison. Comparison invites doubt. Doubt invites authority. Authority is then exercised over you, not because the other person deserves it, but because you installed it. The world judges delivery, because delivery answers a question everyone is asking unconsciously: who is stable here? Stability is read through pace, through silence, through the ability to leave space untouched. A person who can let a statement hang without rushing to support it appears anchored. A person who rushes to support it appears to fear collapse. Even if collapse never would have occurred, the fear itself becomes evidence. There is a cruelty in this system that people resist accepting. It means sincerity offers no protection. It means good intentions can make you weaker. It means being right is irrelevant if you behave as though being wrong would destroy you. The world does not punish error as harshly as it punishes fragility. Fragility invites use. Error can be ignored or corrected. Fragility cannot be unseen once displayed. This is why debates often end with the calm person winning regardless of substance. The calmer one speaks less, not because they have less to say, but because they do not need to say it. Their lack of urgency reads as confidence in reality itself. They assume the truth does not require defense. That assumption alone elevates them. The other person, meanwhile, exhausts themselves trying to be precise, fair, complete. Exhaustion reads as weakness, even when it comes from effort. People rarely admit this to themselves because it implicates them. It suggests that many past losses were not caused by injustice, but by their own delivery. That is a painful realization. It means that each time they defended themselves, they were not correcting a misunderstanding. They were advertising insecurity. They were teaching others how much pressure it takes to make them bend. Once you see this, you begin to notice how rarely powerful people explain themselves. They issue statements. They answer questions briefly or not at all. They allow others to disagree without rushing to resolve it. This is not arrogance, it is structural. They understand instinctively or through experience that delivery is the battlefield. They choose not to fight on it. The opposite pattern is just as visible. The person who is always clarifying, always contextualizing, always worried about how things might be taken. They believe they are being responsible. In reality, they are slowly eroding their own position. Each explanation lowers the weight of their words. Each defense shrinks the space they are allowed to occupy without challenge. The most dangerous lie people tell themselves is that the world wants to understand them. It does not. It wants to place them, and it places them based on how they move under pressure. Delivery is movement. Silence is stillness. Stillness communicates that the ground beneath you is solid enough to stand on without reinforcement. When you speak to defend the truth, you tell everyone that the truth needs you. When you let the truth stand without you, you tell everyone that you are not afraid of how it will be received. The world listens to the second posture more closely, even if it pretends otherwise. By the time the moment ends, the judgment has already been made, not about what was true, but about who needed to speak. And once that judgment settles, it does not announce itself. It simply changes how freely others feel they can question you next time. An accusation does something subtle before it does anything obvious. It rearranges the room, not physically, but hierarchically. The moment it is spoken, a role is implied. Someone is suddenly positioned as the one who must answer. Someone else is positioned as the one who may assess. This shift happens even if the words are casual, even if they are framed as a question, even if they are delivered with a smile. The structure installs itself automatically, and most people walk into it without noticing, because the doorway looks like conversation. The trap is not the accusation. The trap is the assumption that it deserves a response. That assumption is what turns an interaction into a courtroom. Courtrooms do not require walls or judges' robes. They require only one thing: someone who believes they are being evaluated. The moment you believe that, you begin behaving like a defendant. You gather facts, you arrange timelines, you prepare to prove innocence. And once that shift occurs, the other person does not need to do anything. The courtroom is now active. Every courtroom has an authority structure. Someone speaks, someone listens, someone decides whether what was said was sufficient. When you answer an accusation, you accept this structure as real. You may tell yourself you are simply clarifying. What you are actually doing is acknowledging the other person's right to judge you. That acknowledgement is the true concession. Everything else is theater. Notice how quickly the language changes once the courtroom appears. You stop stating, you start explaining. Statements belong to equals or superiors. Explanations belong to subordinates. They are offered upward. They are shaped to persuade. They assume the listener has the power to accept or reject them. Even if the listener never asked for that power, your behavior grants it. Power does not need consent. It needs recognition. The courtroom trap is seductive because it feels like fairness. You believe that by answering, you are restoring balance. You imagine that reason will dissolve the accusation, that clarity will resolve tension. But courtrooms are not built to dissolve tension. They are built to formalize it. Once you step inside, the goal is no longer understanding. It is verdict. And verdicts are rarely kind to those who argue from below. This is why innocence argued so often collapses into guilt. Not because the facts change, but because the posture does. The more you defend, the more invested you appear. The more invested you appear, the more there must be something to defend. Listeners may not consciously think this, but the impression forms anyway. Why are they trying so hard? Why does this matter so much to them? Why do they need me to accept this? Questions like these arise automatically when someone pleads their case. Once the courtroom is active, everything you say is filtered through suspicion. Details become suspicious, context becomes evasive, tone becomes evidence. Even silence after you begin defending is read as calculation. There is no neutral move inside this structure. You are already cast. The role determines interpretation. You cannot argue your way out of a frame you accepted by entering it. What makes this especially dangerous is that the courtroom often exists only in your mind. The other person may not have intended to accuse you. They may not be seeking a verdict at all. But your response upgrades the interaction anyway. By answering as if you are on trial, you inform them that you believe they have the standing to put you there. Many people will accept this invitation without hesitation, not out of malice but out of instinct. Humans step into authority when it is offered. This is how minor comments become power shifts. A casual remark at a dinner table, a vague question in a meeting, a partner's offhand tone. None of these require explanation. But once explanation is given, they retroactively become accusations. The courtroom is built backward. Your defense creates the crime. Your urgency creates the charge. You end up answering for something that did not exist until you acknowledged it. Identity is where the trap tightens. Facts can be corrected without surrender. Identity cannot. When you defend who you are, rather than what happened, you hand over ownership of yourself. You argue that you are not careless, not selfish, not incompetent. By doing so, you accept that the other person has the authority to label you. Labels stick because they operate above facts. They define how future facts will be interpreted. Once identity is on trial, the courtroom never closes. Every future action becomes evidence. Every mistake becomes confirmation. Every silence becomes suspicious. You have placed yourself in a permanent position of defense, where your behavior is constantly scanned for alignment with a standard you did not choose. This is not because others are cruel. It is because systems persist once activated. The most damaging part is how normal this feels. Society trains people to believe that answering accusations is responsible, that not answering looks guilty. This belief keeps the courtroom alive everywhere. It ensures that power flows upward toward those who are most comfortable judging. Those who refuse the frame are labeled arrogant or evasive, but they retain something far more valuable than approval. They retain position. Position is not loud. It does not argue. It does not persuade. It simply refuses to kneel. When you do not step into the courtroom, the accusation has nowhere to land. It hangs in the air, unfinished. The person who spoke it must then decide whether to escalate, retreat, or expose themselves by pushing harder. That moment of decision is what most people are trying to avoid when they explain. They would rather submit than let tension remain unresolved. But unresolved tension is not a flaw, it is leverage. The courtroom exists to resolve tension in favor of whoever controls the verdict. By stepping into it, you ensure the resolution will not favor you. You may feel temporary relief after explaining, but relief is not power. Relief is the sensation of having complied. Most people never realize they entered a courtroom until long after the verdict has been delivered. They sense the shift in how they are treated. They notice they are questioned more freely, interrupted more easily, expected to justify things others are not. They call this being misunderstood. In reality, it is being positioned, and the positioning began the moment they answered a charge that never required a defense. Once you see the courtroom for what it is, you cannot unsee it. You notice how often it is activated by reflex, how often you have walked into it willingly, and how quiet the room becomes when you do not. Authority does not announce itself, it waits for you to grant it shape. The most efficient way it gains that shape is through your compliance with its rituals. One of those rituals is answering questions that were never neutral. Another is clarifying yourself to people who did not earn clarity. The courtroom does not need a gavel, it needs your cooperation, and cooperation often looks like politeness. When you answer, you imagine you are closing a gap. In reality, you are widening one. You speak from the position of the one being examined. The other person does not need to raise their voice or sharpen their accusation. Your response sharpens it for them. By explaining, you formalize the imbalance. You tell them, without words, that they are entitled to an account of you. Entitlement is the seed of dominance. Once planted, it grows quietly. The most revealing moment is not the accusation itself, but what follows your explanation. Watch how the other person listens. They do not listen as an equal. They listen as a processor, as someone deciding whether your answer satisfies a requirement. They may nod, they may ask a follow-up, they may say nothing at all. Each of these responses keeps you inside the frame. You are still answering, still responding, still oriented toward their judgment. This is why explanations multiply. One answer invites another question. One clarification invites another doubt. The structure feeds itself. You feel as though you are being reasonable, cooperative, engaged. What you are actually doing is staying on the stand. Every additional sentence extends the trial. Every attempt to resolve it deepens your involvement. You are no longer speaking to express reality. You are speaking to be cleared. The need to be cleared is the clearest sign that authority has been accepted. People who do not accept authority do not seek clearance. They do not rush to restore their image. They do not scramble to correct narratives. They allow narratives to exist without interference. This is not because they are careless. It is because they do not locate their standing inside the minds of others. Their position is not up for review. Explaining yourself assumes that misunderstanding is dangerous enough to require immediate correction. That assumption reveals how fragile your sense of position is. If being seen incorrectly feels intolerable, it means your identity depends on external confirmation. That dependence places you beneath whoever is doing the seeing. You may dislike this dynamic, but your behavior sustains it. People often confuse respect with responsiveness. They believe that answering quickly and thoroughly earns goodwill. Sometimes it does. But goodwill earned through submission is not respect. It is tolerance. And tolerance is conditional. It lasts only as long as you continue to perform. The moment you stop explaining, the same people who seemed satisfied may become irritated, not because you did anything wrong, but because you disrupted a structure they had grown comfortable inside. The courtroom trap thrives on your fear of appearing evasive. Evasion feels dishonest to those trained to explain. Silence feels like guilt. This belief is learned early and reinforced often. It ensures compliance. It ensures that whenever pressure appears, speech follows. The fear of seeming guilty becomes stronger than the desire to remain sovereign. You choose appearance over position and call it integrity. What is rarely acknowledged is that innocence does not require demonstration. Only guilt does. Demonstration implies doubt. Doubt implies authority. Authority implies hierarchy. When you demonstrate innocence, you accept all four. You may tell yourself that you are clearing your name. What you are actually doing is placing your name into circulation, available for judgment whenever someone chooses to raise a question. Once this pattern is established, it spreads. Others notice that you answer. They notice that you explain. They notice that pressure works. They may not exploit it consciously, but systems do not require consciousness to function. A pattern that rewards pressure will invite pressure. A posture that yields under scrutiny will attract scrutiny. Over time, You will find yourself questioned more than others, challenged more freely, expected to account for things that pass unquestioned elsewhere. This is how people become permanent defendants in their own lives. They are always responding, always clarifying, always managing impressions. They believe they are participating. In reality, they are orbiting other people's judgments. Their energy is spent maintaining acceptability rather than occupying space. They mistake exhaustion for effort and effort for virtue. The cruel twist is that many accusations dissolve on their own if left untouched. Unanswered implications often lose momentum. Questions not immediately addressed often reveal their emptiness. The person who raised them must either escalate openly or retreat silently. Escalation exposes intent. Retreat restores balance. Explanation prevents both. It rescues the accuser from having to commit. By answering, you save them from risk. You do the dangerous part for them. You step forward while they remain protected. That inversion is the essence of submission. Power belongs to the one who can afford to wait. The courtroom punishes those who cannot. Over time, you may notice a strange fatigue. Not physical, but existential. A sense that you are always justifying your presence, that conversations feel like tests, that interactions carry a low hum of evaluation. This is not because the world is hostile, it is because you taught it how to treat you. You taught it that you will explain when pressed. That lesson does not unlearn itself. Once authority is accepted, it rarely gives itself back. It must be withdrawn. And withdrawal does not look like argument, it looks like refusal. Refusal to step into the structure at all. That refusal is what most people fear more than accusation, because it means letting tension exist without resolution. It means standing in uncertainty without moving. Those who cannot tolerate that uncertainty will always choose the courtroom. Those who can will notice how often the room rearranges itself when they do not. There is a moment after you explain when something shifts. And it is not relief. It feels like it at first because the tension drops inside you. But outside you, a different tension takes its place. The other person grows quieter. Their posture changes. They listen less actively. They are no longer engaged in exchange. They are engaged in assessment. You can feel it if you pay attention. The air cools. The rhythm slows, but not in your favor. The energy has moved across the table, and it does not return. This is where most people misread what is happening. They think the conversation has settled. They believe clarity has been achieved. In reality, judgment has begun. Your explanation has not resolved anything. It has provided material to be weighed, interpreted, stored. You are no longer interacting. You are being processed. That is the price of stepping into the courtroom. You do not leave when you finish speaking. You remain present as an object of evaluation, long after your words end. Judgment rarely announces itself. It does not say you are wrong or right. It simply adjusts how much gravity you are allowed to have going forward. The person judging may not even know they are doing it. Their body takes cues from yours. Your effort tells them you are movable. Your urgency tells them you are responsive to pressure. Their nervous system registers this and recalibrates. From then on, they interact with you from a slightly higher position without ever deciding to. This is why people who explain often feel subtly diminished afterward. Nothing overt happened. No insult was delivered. No argument was lost. Yet something feels off. The respect in the room feels thinner. Interruptions come sooner. Questions feel sharper. Expectations shift without discussion. You sense that you are now expected to account for yourself more often. That expectation did not arise from facts. It arose from posture. Judgment feeds on availability. The more available you make yourself for evaluation, the more evaluation occurs. When you answer every implication, you create a pattern where your behavior is always open for review. Silence interrupts that pattern. Explanation sustains it. Once sustained, it becomes normal. People stop noticing that they are judging you because you have normalized the act of being judged. The most damaging part is that judgment feels deserved once you accept the courtroom. You begin to preemptively evaluate yourself. You replay conversations. You refine explanations you never got to give. You imagine how you should have sounded. This internalization is the final victory of the structure. You no longer need an external judge. You have installed one inside yourself. That judge speaks in your own voice and questions you constantly. This is how people become cautious versions of themselves. They measure sentences before speaking. They soften edges. They anticipate reactions. They believe they are becoming thoughtful. In reality, they are shrinking. Their speech is no longer an expression. It is a negotiation. Negotiation implies something is at stake, something that can be taken away. That something is always status. Those who live inside this pattern rarely realize how much of their life is spent managing judgment. They call it professionalism. They call it maturity. They call it being considerate. What they do not see is that consideration offered upward is submission. Consideration offered laterally is cooperation. The difference is invisible unless you know where to look. It shows up in who feels free to remain silent and who feels compelled to explain. Judgment also has a memory. It remembers how you behaved last time. If you defended yourself once, you are more likely to be questioned again, not because you were wrong, but because the system learned that questioning yields compliance. People are not malicious, they are efficient. They repeat behaviors that work. Explanation works. It produces engagement. It produces reassurance. It produces movement. Silence produces none of these, which is why it feels threatening to those accustomed to control. When you do not explain, judgment has no foothold. It cannot evaluate what is not offered. It cannot weigh what is not placed on the scale. This frustrates those who rely on evaluation to maintain position. They may label you difficult or aloof. These labels are attempts to reassert the frame. They are invitations to step back into the courtroom. Accepting the label is optional. Explaining it is submission. The fear that stops most people from resisting this is the fear of being seen as guilty. That fear assumes that judgment is inevitable and must be managed. In reality, judgment requires participation. Without it, it remains speculative. Speculation is uncomfortable. People resolve discomfort by pushing harder or backing away. Both outcomes reveal more than explanation ever could. Once you understand this, you begin to see how often judgment collapses when unsupported. Accusations lose momentum. Questions trail off. Conversations move on. The world does not end. What ends is the illusion that you must always account for yourself. That illusion persists only as long as you feed it. The final cruelty of judgment is that it convinces you that compliance is safety. You explain to feel safe. You answer to reduce tension. You defend to restore equilibrium. But safety purchased this way is temporary. It requires constant payment. Each explanation buys you a moment of peace at the cost of future position. The bill always comes due. Those who refuse this economy appear strange at first. They do not rush to clarify. They let misunderstandings exist. They allow others to sit with their own assumptions. This unsettles people conditioned to evaluation. It forces them to confront uncertainty without assistance. Some will push harder. Others will disengage. In either case, the dynamic changes, not through force but through absence. Judgment cannot operate without material. When you stop providing it, the structure weakens. Not dramatically, quietly, invisibly. The room begins to feel different. You are not lighter, you are heavier, not because you spoke more convincingly, but because you spoke less. And in that less, something solid formed that did not require approval to exist. Guilt is not produced by wrongdoing, it is produced by defensiveness. Defensiveness suggests fear of exposure. Fear of exposure suggests something to hide. This logic is crude, but it is deeply embedded in human perception. People trust their instincts long before they trust evidence. When someone moves to protect themselves, observers feel justified in probing. The probe feels reasonable. After all, why protect what is secure? This is why arguing innocence so often backfires. Each explanation tightens the suspicion it was meant to dispel. Each clarification adds another surface to inspect. The listener begins to look for inconsistencies, not because they doubt you, but because the structure invites doubt. You have framed yourself as a case. Cases are examined. Examined things are never left alone. There is a point where innocence stops mattering entirely. Most people never see it because they spend their lives trying to prove they have it. They believe innocence is a shield. In reality, innocence argued is a confession of vulnerability. The moment you try to establish that you are not at fault, you concede that fault is a meaningful category in the interaction. You accept the premise that guilt and innocence are being weighed, and once they are being weighed, you are already inside the machine. Convincing is the wrong goal. Convincing implies resistance. Resistance implies conflict. Conflict implies hierarchy. In a conflict, someone must win. The one who explains rarely does. They are too busy trying to be accepted to assert position. They trade leverage for likability and call it peace. Notice how quickly the conversation shifts once innocence becomes the focus. The other person stops sharing their own perspective. They stop revealing themselves. They ask more questions. They lean back. The flow becomes one-directional. You are speaking. They are evaluating. Even if they say nothing, the silence is no longer neutral. It is weighted. It asks whether you have said enough, whether you have said too much, whether you sound convincing. What makes this particularly dangerous is that innocence is an identity claim. You are not just describing events. You are asserting who you are. When you defend identity, you place it into the hands of others. You allow them to agree or disagree with your self-definition. That is a quiet surrender of sovereignty. Once surrendered, it is rarely returned voluntarily. Most people, however, rush to claim it. They feel exposed when it is questioned. Exposure feels dangerous because identity is where self-worth lives. Cortisol drives them to protect it. In doing so, they make it visible. Once visible, it becomes targetable. The very thing they were trying to shield becomes the lever used against them. This is why powerful figures avoid defending identity. They correct facts if necessary. They do not argue who they are. They let their identity remain unspoken, unlitigated, unowned by the room. This frustrates those who want to pin them down. Identity cannot be attacked if it is not offered. It cannot be refuted if it is not claimed. Identity defenses sound subtle. Phrases like, "I would never do that," "That's not who I am," "You know me better than that." These statements feel natural. They feel human. They also invite judgment at the deepest level. You are asking the other person to validate your character. Validation is power. Whoever gives it holds it. There is a humiliation that comes with realizing how often you have done this. How often you have argued that you are good, fair, honest, competent. How often you have needed others to agree. That need is not moral weakness. It is conditioning, but it has consequences all the same. It places your worth in circulation. It allows others to negotiate it. Once innocence is on trial, the outcome does not matter. Even acquittal is a loss. Being cleared implies you could have been condemned. That implication lingers. People remember that you stood accused, not that you were absolved. The stain is not factual. It is structural. You accepted the possibility of judgment. That acceptance remains. This is why some accusations feel sticky, even when disproven. They never needed to be true to have effect. They only needed to activate defense. Defense does the rest. It creates memory. It creates narrative. It creates a shadow that follows you quietly. The world learns quickly who will do this work, who will carry the burden of resolution, who will rush to clean the air. Those people are rewarded with more opportunities to clean, more chances to prove innocence, more subtle accusations. It becomes a loop. Each defense justifies the next challenge. There is also a cost to the accuser that you rarely see because you shield them from it. By defending yourself, you protect them from having to stand by their implication. You spare them the discomfort of escalation. You save them from exposure. If they were bluffing, you never find out. If they were projecting, you absorb it. Explanation is generous in the worst possible way. It takes responsibility for dynamics you did not create. Eventually, innocence becomes a trap rather than a refuge. You are always almost clear, almost understood, almost resolved, always one explanation away from peace. That peace never arrives because the structure that promised it depends on your continued participation. Those who exit this structure do not do so by proving anything. They do so by refusing the premise entirely. They stop treating accusations as meaningful unless they come with consequence. They stop offering identity for evaluation. They let innocence remain unspoken and therefore untested. When you stop defending innocence, something uncomfortable happens. Silence stretches. The other person must decide what to do with their implication. Some will retreat, some will press. Either way, the burden shifts off you, and for the first time, you see how heavy it always was. This is not because they are guilty. It is because they understand something most people do not. Innocence does not protect you. Position does. And position is never argued. It is occupied. The most dangerous thing about innocence is not losing it. It is trying to keep it visible. By the time you realize you have accepted authority, it has already settled into the interaction. It does not arrive with force. It arrives with comfort. The comfort of knowing what role to play. The comfort of responding when spoken to. The comfort of explaining yourself so the tension eases. Authority loves comfort. It grows fastest where resistance is disguised as cooperation. Once you answer an accusation, you do not just accept judgment in that moment. You establish a precedent. You teach the room how power moves through you. You demonstrate that your position is conditional, responsive, adjustable under pressure. People do not need to think about this lesson. They absorb it. And what is absorbed becomes expectation. Expectation is where authority becomes permanent. From that point on, you are no longer treated as someone who simply acts. You are treated as someone who must account. Decisions you make invite commentary. Statements you make invite clarification. Silence you hold invites suspicion. The space around you tightens slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to shape behavior. You begin anticipating questions before they are asked. You begin editing yourself in advance. Authority no longer needs to assert itself. You are doing the work for it. This is how ownership of self slips away without drama. You start to feel as though you owe people explanations, not because they demanded them, but because the structure now assumes they are owed. That assumption feels moral. It feels like responsibility. It feels like being an adult. In reality, it is habituated submission. You have learned that peace is purchased by accounting for yourself, and you pay automatically. Authority thrives on this because it is efficient. It does not need to coerce you. You volunteer. You step forward whenever tension appears. You smooth things over. You clarify intentions. You prevent misunderstandings before they become problems. From the outside, you look helpful. From the inside, you are always bracing, always monitoring, always ready to justify. The cost of this posture is not immediate humiliation. It is slow erosion. Over time, you notice that your words carry less finality, that decisions you make invite negotiation, that boundaries you set are treated as openings rather than lines. You feel a subtle obligation to explain yourself whenever you assert something. Assertion without explanation feels rude now, dangerous. This feeling did not arise naturally. It was trained. Once authority is internalized, it shapes how others speak to you. They grow comfortable questioning, comfortable probing, comfortable suggesting alternatives to your choices. They may frame this as collaboration, but collaboration assumes parity. What you are experiencing is review. Review happens downward. Those above are not reviewed. They are interpreted. You might resist this idea because it sounds harsh, because it implies that many interactions you considered equal were not. But equality is not declared. It is demonstrated through behavior. When one person feels compelled to explain and the other feels free to interpret, equality is absent regardless of intention. This is why defending yourself feels so reasonable and produces such poor outcomes. It aligns with social training while undermining position. Society rewards those who appear cooperative. Power rewards those who remain unmoved. The two are not the same. Confusing them leads to a life of constant adjustment, where your standing depends on how well you manage other people's impressions. Authority also feeds on consistency. Once you have accepted it once, refusing it later feels like a violation. People react not to your silence, but to the change. They feel something is off. You are no longer playing your part. This discomfort motivates them to push harder, to reassert the familiar dynamic. They may accuse you of being different, distant, uncommunicative. These are not observations. They are attempts to restore the structure. If you respond to those attempts with explanation, the structure locks in again. If you resist, the tension rises. This rising tension is what most people are trying to avoid. They would rather submit quietly than endure discomfort openly. Authority counts on this preference. It knows that unresolved tension feels worse than compliance to those who are conditioned to explain. What is rarely acknowledged is that authority loses strength when it is not fed. It requires response. It requires engagement. It requires acknowledgement. Without these, it becomes unstable. The person attempting to exercise it must escalate or retreat. Escalation exposes intent. Retreat collapses position. Either outcome costs them something. Explanation costs you something instead. The fear that keeps authority alive is the fear of social consequence, being seen as difficult, as cold, as arrogant. This fear assumes that approval is the currency of survival. It is not. Position is approval can be withdrawn at any time. Position endures as long as it is occupied. Those who maintain position understand this instinctively. They do not rush to soothe. They do not preemptively justify. They let discomfort exist without claiming responsibility for it. This does not make them cruel. It makes them unmovable. The difference is subtle but absolute. Once you see how authority installs itself through your own mouth, you cannot unknow it. You notice how often you speak to reduce tension rather than state reality. How often you explain to be safe rather than remain solid. How often you mistake compliance for peace. Authority does not need your agreement to exist. It needs your participation. The moment you stop participating, it weakens. Not dramatically, quietly. The room feels strange at first, unbalanced, as if something expected did not happen. That expectation was never yours to meet. When you no longer accept the need to explain yourself, authority has nowhere to land. It cannot judge what is not offered. It cannot evaluate what does not step forward. It waits, and in that waiting the hierarchy reveals itself. Most people never see this moment, because they rush to fill it. They cannot tolerate the silence long enough to watch the structure strain. They speak and the authority relaxes back into place. Those who do not speak feel the strain instead, and they recognize it for what it is. The sound of a system losing its grip. The habit did not begin in adulthood. That is the part that makes it difficult to uproot. Long before you learned the language of professionalism, or relationships or reputation, your body learned something simpler. When authority is displeased, explanation reduces pain. When confusion appears, clarity is demanded. When silence lingers too long, consequences follow. This lesson was not taught gently. It was taught repeatedly, under conditions where you were small enough that resistance was not an option. As a child, you did not explain because you wanted to be understood. You explained because misunderstanding carried threat. The threat may have been punishment, withdrawal, disappointment, ridicule, or coldness. It does not matter which. Your nervous system recorded only the pattern. Displeasure appeared. You spoke quickly. You justified. You corrected. The tension eased. Relief followed. The lesson embedded itself. Without language, speech equals safety. Authority figures reinforced this every day without realizing it. Teachers demanded reasons. Parents demanded explanations. Adults framed questioning as accountability and called it character building. But to a nervous system without power, it was conditioning. You learned that your inner state did not matter. What mattered was how effectively you could align yourself with external judgment. You learn to anticipate evaluation and get ahead of it. This is why the reflex feels moral. It was wrapped in morality early. Explain yourself. Be responsible. Don't talk back. Use your words. All of these phrases sound neutral. None of them are. They train one-directional speech. They teach that authority asks and you answer, that silence is defiance, that refusal is guilt. By the time you reached adulthood, the structure felt natural. You did not experience it as submission, you experienced it as maturity. The body does not forget the conditions under which it learned. When an adult questions you now, your nervous system does not register adulthood. It registers hierarchy. The same chemical cascade activates, the same urgency to clarify, the same fear of being misread. You may know intellectually that no one can punish you the way they once could. Your body does not care. It is responding to a familiar signal with a familiar solution. This is why explaining feels automatic, even when it is irrational, even when you know better, even when you tell yourself to pause. The reflex predates conscious choice. It belongs to a time when choice was not available, and because it once worked, it feels trustworthy. You mistake familiarity for correctness. What makes this humiliating is how cleanly the past installs itself into the present. Bosses inherit parental authority. Partners inherit it. Strangers inherit it. Anyone whose tone implies evaluation activates the old structure. You are no longer interacting as an equal adult. You are reenacting a survival pattern, and reenactments do not ask whether they are appropriate. They simply run. This is why some people feel inexplicably small in certain interactions. They cannot name why a simple question unsettles them. They cannot explain why they suddenly feel the need to justify choices that require no justification. The answer is not in the question. It is in the memory the question touches. Authority does not need to be real. It only needs to be reminiscent. The most dangerous part of this conditioning is that it rewards itself. Each time you explain and the tension eases, the body logs success. It does not log the long-term cost. It logs immediate relief. That relief becomes addictive. You begin to chase it unconsciously. You speak to feel better, not to assert reality. Over time, your speech becomes a soothing mechanism rather than a tool of expression. This is how adulthood becomes crowded with unnecessary explanations. You explain choices. You explain boundaries. You explain preferences. You explain tone. You explain silence. You explain yourself into exhaustion. And because explanation is framed as virtue, no one stops you. In fact, people come to expect it. They are confused when it does not arrive. Confusion becomes accusation. The loop tightens. What no one tells you is that authority does not need explanation to function. It needs compliance. Explanation is simply the most elegant form of it. It looks voluntary. It sounds reasonable. It feels cooperative. That is why it is so effective. You participate willingly in your own evaluation and call it communication. Childhood taught you that being understood was the path to safety. Adulthood demands something harsher. Being unmovable is the path to position. The two are not compatible. One requires exposure. The other requires opacity. Most people never make this distinction because it feels disloyal to the child they once were. Letting go of explanation feels like abandoning a survival strategy that saved them. It feels dangerous even when it is not. This is why resistance produces guilt. Silence feels wrong. Refusal feels rude. The body protests. The old alarms sound. You feel as though you are doing something immoral when you simply do not answer. That feeling is not conscience. It is conditioning. It is the echo of authority that no longer exists, demanding a response out of habit. Once you see this, the reflex becomes impossible to romanticize. It is not honesty. It is not transparency. It is not integrity. It is a learned appeasement behavior that outlived its usefulness. It served you once. It now costs you. The humiliation is not that you learnt it. The humiliation is how long it has been speaking for you without permission. How many times it has stepped forward when you should have remained still. How many relationships and environments it shaped without your awareness. The child learned to explain to survive. The adult who keeps explaining has not realized the danger is gone, or worse, has replaced it with a subtler one. The danger of being forever evaluated because you never learned to stop offering yourself for review. The moment you recognize this pattern as inherited rather than chosen, Something shifts. Not comfort, not relief. Awareness. And awareness is uncomfortable because it removes the excuse of innocence. You are no longer simply reacting, you are repeating. The reflex survives because it is rarely challenged directly. It hides behind language that sounds adult and reasonable. You tell yourself you are being clear. You tell yourself you are being fair. You tell yourself you are preventing conflict. None of these explanations touch the real mechanism at work. The mechanism is obedience, learned so early, it feels like conscience. When you explain yourself, you are not choosing transparency. You are obeying an internal authority that still believes silence will be punished. This is why the body reacts with guilt when you do not answer. The guilt arrives fast and without argument. It does not ask whether the question was legitimate. It does not ask whether the person asking had standing. It simply announces that something is wrong. That wrongness is not ethical. It is procedural. You skipped a step the system expects. You failed to perform the ritual of appeasement. The alarm sounds. That alarm once kept you safe. It does not care that the context has changed. It does not care that you are grown. It does not care that no real consequence exists. It exists to enforce behavior, not to evaluate truth. So when you resist the urge to explain, you feel tension rise instead of fall. The relief you are accustomed to does not arrive. This absence feels dangerous because your body learned to associate relief with survival. Most people retreat at this point. They speak just to make the feeling stop. They call this instinct. They call this intuition. In reality, it is conditioning, demanding compliance. The moment you speak, the alarm quiets. The body relaxes. You feel normal again. That normalcy reinforces the pattern. Silence feels wrong. Explanation feels right. Over time, the distinction becomes moralized. Speaking becomes good. Not speaking becomes bad. This is how authority embeds itself so deeply, it no longer needs external enforcement. You enforce it on yourself. You answer questions no one demanded answers to. You clarify things no one challenged. You volunteer context preemptively. You smooth interactions before friction even appears. You believe you are being considerate. You are actually maintaining a hierarchy where you remain below anyone who might evaluate you. The humiliation of this realization is not theoretical. It is personal. It forces you to look back at moments you thought were misunderstandings and see them as rehearsals. Times you thought you were defending truth and see that you were defending your right to exist comfortably in the room. Times you believed you were communicating and realize you were pleading quietly for stability. This pattern shapes personality over time. People who explain frequently begin to sound the same. Careful, measured, slightly apologetic. Even when confident. They use qualifiers instinctively. They soften statements. They anticipate objections that never come. They live in a constant state of readiness to justify. This readiness feels like intelligence. It is actually fear refined into habit. Those who never develop this reflex appear strange by comparison. They speak bluntly. They allow pauses. They do not rush to fill gaps. They do not rescue conversations from discomfort. This unsettles people trained to explain. It feels cold. It feels arrogant. It feels unsafe. What it actually is unfamiliar. Unfamiliarity is often mistaken for threat. This is why people who stop explaining are often accused of changing. You have changed, but not in the way implied. You have stopped obeying a rule that was never universal. You have stopped assuming that every raised eyebrow requires a response. You have stopped equating silence with danger. That change destabilizes systems built on your compliance. The body resists this change fiercely at first. The old alarms do not shut off easily. They scream when you remain silent. They demand resolution. They demand relief. Sitting with that demand without obeying it feels like defiance against your own nervous system. It feels like holding your breath. This is why so few people persist. It is easier to speak than to endure the discomfort of not speaking. But endurance is the point. The discomfort is not a sign of wrongdoing. It is a sign of withdrawal. You are withdrawing from a system that fed on your explanations. Withdrawal always produces symptoms: anxiety, guilt, restlessness. These symptoms are interpreted by the system as proof that silence is wrong. They are not. They are proof that the system is losing its hold. What eventually becomes clear is that nothing happens if you do not explain. The feared punishment does not arrive. The world does not collapse. The person questioning you must decide what to do next without your assistance. That decision reveals more about them than any explanation ever could. Some will push harder, some will retreat, some will expose motives they would have hidden if you had spoken. This is the moment childhood programming begins to loosen. Not because it is disproven intellectually, but because it fails experientially. The body learns a new association. Silence does not lead to harm. It leads to information. It reveals dynamics rather than smoothing them over. It shows you who relies on your compliance and who does not. Once this learning begins, it cannot be reversed. You become aware of how often explanation was never required, how often it was offered reflexively, how often it served others more than you. This awareness is not comforting. It strips away the story that you were always acting freely. It reveals how much of your behavior was inherited rather than chosen. The final discomfort is realizing that many people preferred you when you explained, not because they respected you more, but because you were easier to manage. You reduced uncertainty for them. You made interactions predictable. You carried the weight of resolution. When you stop, they feel exposed. That exposure is mistaken for your cruelty. You will be tempted to explain this change, to justify your silence, to reassure others that nothing is wrong. That temptation is the reflex making one last appeal. Giving in restores the old order. Resisting allows a new one to form. At this stage, explanation is no longer ignorance. It is a choice. And choices, once recognized, cannot be made unconsciously again. The child explained to survive. The adult who continues explaining does so because the discomfort of stopping feels worse than the cost of continuing. That discomfort is the threshold. Crossing it is not about strength. It is about tolerance. The tolerance to remain silent while the system that trained you waits for a response that does not come. And when it does not come, something quiet but irreversible happens. The authority that once lived in your mouth begins to starve. Once the reflex weakens, something else becomes visible, and it is not pleasant. You begin to notice how often authority was never real to begin with. How many people relied entirely on your participation to feel powerful. How thin their position was once you stopped propping it up. This realization does not feel empowering at first. It feels embarrassing. It reframes years of interactions as unnecessary performances where you played the smaller role by default. You see how often questions were not requests for information but tests of compliance. How often comments were not observations but probes. How often silence from another person was bait. When you were explaining, these distinctions were blurred. Everything felt urgent. Everything felt meaningful. Once you stop explaining, the shape of these interactions sharpens. You see intention where you once saw confusion. You see leverage where you once saw curiosity. This is where humiliation deepens. You recognize how frequently you mistook dominance for confidence, how often you granted weight to opinions that had none without your cooperation. The person questioning you did not need to be smarter, more experienced, or more correct. They only needed you to respond as if they were, and you did, repeatedly, without being asked. What becomes unbearable is realizing how much of your energy was spent maintaining other people's sense of relevance. By answering, you made their thoughts matter. By clarifying, you elevated their interpretations. By defending, you treated their judgments as consequential. Silence withdraws that elevation. It does not attack them. It simply refuses to assign importance where none was earned. This refusal is often misread as hostility. It is not. Hostility requires engagement. Silence is absence of participation, but absence is threatening to those who depend on reaction. They begin to fill the gap themselves. They speak more, they justify their questions, they explain why they asked, they defend their curiosity. This reversal is not strategic, it is automatic. Humans are uncomfortable when their bids for evaluation are ignored. In these moments you witness something most people never do. You watch the other person step onto the stand you vacated. They begin accounting for themselves. They offer context unprompted. They soften their tone. They seek alignment. The structure flips not because you did anything, but because you did not. Power moves to the one who can tolerate the vacuum. This is also where many people sabotage themselves. The moment the other person begins explaining, guilt surges. You feel rude. You feel cold. You feel as though you have violated a social rule. That feeling is the old programming reasserting itself. It urges you to rescue the interaction, to reassure, to smooth, to take responsibility for the discomfort in the room. If you do, the structure snaps back instantly. The window closes. Most people cannot tolerate this phase. They are disturbed by how quickly roles reverse. It exposes how fragile social hierarchies are, how dependent they are on unspoken agreements, how easily they collapse when one person stops playing along. This exposure feels destabilizing, not liberating. It makes you question how much of your life was governed by invisible scripts you never agreed to consciously. The temptation at this stage is to moralize, to tell yourself that refusing to explain is selfish or antisocial. This moral framing is another inheritance. It was taught early to ensure obedience felt virtuous. When you remove explanation, you are not removing kindness. You are removing submission. The two were conflated deliberately because it made authority easier to maintain. What becomes clear is that many people confuse being accessible with being respectful. They believe respect means availability, immediate answers, emotional transparency, predictable reactions. These beliefs benefit those who want influence without responsibility. Silence disrupts this economy. It introduces friction. Friction reveals who expected access without cost. You also begin to notice how unevenly explanation was distributed. How often you explained upward and rarely downward. How often you justified yourself to those with no real stake in your actions. How rarely those same people justified themselves to you. This asymmetry felt normal before. It does not now. It feels exploitative. There is a quiet anger that surfaces here. Not explosive, cold, directed inward first. You recognize how often you volunteered your position for review. How often you spoke to preempt judgment that never would have materialized. How often you traded stillness for acceptance. That anger is not meant to be expressed. It is meant to recalibrate. It sharpens discernment. It teaches restraint. Restraint becomes the new skill. Not the restraint of words, but the restraint of impulse. The impulse to correct. The impulse to clarify. The impulse to be seen as reasonable. Each impulse carries the same signature. A slight tightening, a sense of urgency, a desire to move. You learn to notice it without obeying it. This noticing is not calm, it is tense. But tension held is different from tension discharged. Held tension has weight. Discharged tension disappears. As this restraint develops, something unexpected happens. People begin to approach you differently. Not all people. Those who relied on your explanations grow distant or agitated. Those who did not need them remain unchanged. Some become more careful with their words. Others test you gently at first, then more directly. Each test is an attempt to see whether the old access still exists, whether pressure still works. When you do not respond as before, the tests reveal intent. You see who was curious and who was controlling, who was interested and who was entitled. Explanation once blurred these categories because it treated all inquiries as equal. Silence separates them cleanly. The separation is not kind, but it is precise. This precision is what most people never experience. They live in a fog of over-communication, unable to tell who respects them and who merely consumes their energy. By withdrawing explanation, the fog lifts. Interactions simplify. Some disappear, others deepen. What remains is quieter but heavier. Fewer words carry more weight. At this stage, the danger is not external, it is internal relapse. The reflex waits for fatigue, for loneliness, for moments when tension feels unbearable. It whispers that one explanation will not hurt. That clarity will restore connection. That silence is unnecessary now. Each time you resist, the reflex weakens. Each time you indulge it, it regains strength. This is not a battle fought once. It is a pattern dismantled slowly. The final humiliation of this stage is accepting that many of your past explanations were not misunderstood acts of goodwill. They were concessions, not demanded, offered freely, and once offered, taken. Seeing this does not make you superior. It makes you careful. Careful with words, careful with access, careful with who gets to hear your reasons and who does not. Careful not to confuse openness with exposure. You stop explaining not because you want to dominate, but because you finally understand how much you gave away without realizing it. And once you understand that, silence stops feeling empty. The discomfort intensifies when you realize how much of your identity was built around being explainable, being understood, being acceptable. You notice that many of your traits were shaped to survive evaluation. Your patience, your carefulness, your tendency to soften statements. These were not neutral qualities. They were adaptations, useful once, costly now. As explanation withdraws, identity destabilizes. You no longer rush to present yourself in a coherent, palatable way. You stop narrating your intentions. You stop translating yourself for comfort. This creates a gap between who you are and how others perceive you. That gap feels dangerous at first. It feels like losing control. In reality, it is relinquishing a control that never belonged to you. People accustomed to your clarity become uneasy. They feel less certain about you. That uncertainty unsettles them because certainty was a privilege they grew used to. They had access to your motives, your reasoning, your inner world. You offered it freely. When that access closes, they experience it as loss. Loss often masquerades as accusation. They may say you are distant, guarded, different. These words are not observations. They are negotiations, attempts to reopen access, to re-establish the old dynamic. The urge to explain yourself here is powerful. You want to reassure them. You want to say nothing is wrong. You want to clarify that you are still the same. Doing so restores their comfort at the cost of your position. The choice becomes visible. What emerges in this stage is a sharper awareness of boundaries. Not declared boundaries, behavioral ones. Who you explain to, who you do not. Who feels entitled to your inner reasoning, who accepts your presence without it. This sorting happens naturally. Once you stop equalizing everyone with explanation, silence performs the sorting for you. The unsettling part is discovering how few people remain unchanged. Many relationships were built on access to your justifications. Without them, the connection thins, conversations shorten, interest wanes. This is not loss of affection, it is loss of utility. Explanation made you useful as a stabilizer, a resolver, a translator of discomfort. When you stop performing this role, those who depended on it drift away. There is grief here, though it is rarely acknowledged. You are not just withdrawing a behavior. You are withdrawing a version of yourself that others relied on. That version was shaped by compliance and rewarded by acceptance. Letting it go feels like betrayal, not of others, but of an identity that once kept you safe. What replaces it is not confidence. It is opacity. You become harder to read. Not deliberately, naturally. You stop preempting interpretation. You stop offering context before it is requested. You stop managing reactions. This opacity creates friction. Friction reveals pressure points. Pressure points reveal motives. Some people respond to opacity with curiosity. Others respond with control. The difference becomes obvious quickly. Curiosity waits. Control pushes. Curiosity does not require explanation. Control does. Silence feeds one and starves the other. At this point, many people make a mistake. They weaponize silence. They use it performatively. They withhold to punish. This collapses the structure in a different way. Silence used as a tactic still centers the other person. True withdrawal of explanation is not about manipulation. It is about refusal to participate in frames that diminish you. The distinction matters because the body knows the difference. One is tense, the other is settled. As the settled silence develops, your internal landscape changes. The constant scanning for misunderstanding fades. The need to correct impressions weakens. You speak less, but when you do, the words feel heavier, not because they are aggressive, but because they are no longer diluted by fear of reception. You say what is true and leave it alone. This unsettles those who relied on your responsiveness. They test you in subtle ways. They raise implications and wait. They watch your face. They look for movement. When none comes, they feel exposed. Exposure produces anxiety. Anxiety produces behavior. This behavior is informative. You learn who feels threatened by your stillness and who does not notice it at all. The temptation here is to reinsert explanation to relieve the tension, to make things smooth again. Smoothness is seductive. It promises ease, but ease achieved through self-erasure is not peace. It is anesthesia. You wake up later in the same position, wondering how you got there again. This stage demands something unfamiliar. Endurance without narrative. You do not explain why you are silent. You do not justify your change. You let others interpret. Their interpretations belong to them. Taking responsibility for them would reinstall the old hierarchy. As this endurance continues, something irreversible happens. Your sense of self decouples from immediate perception. You no longer feel compelled to exist correctly in other people's minds. This is not indifference. It is sovereignty. You still care about outcomes. You no longer chase validation. The cost of this shift is social friction. The benefit is internal alignment. You begin to feel solid in a way that does not require reinforcement. Not confident, not arrogant, grounded. Grounded enough that misunderstanding no longer feels like danger. At this point, explanation begins to feel invasive, like giving away something private without consent. You become selective, not secretive, selective. Reasons are shared when there is shared standing. Silence is maintained when there is not. This selectivity redraws the map of your relationships. Some routes close, others become clearer. The map is simpler, but it is not empty. It reflects reality rather than accommodation. You no longer explain to be safe. You explain, if at all, because it serves a purpose you chose. The difference is subtle to others. It is absolute to you. This is the stage where many turn back. The loneliness can be sharp. The reflex still whispers. It reminds you how easy it would be to smooth everything over, to be liked again, to be understood. That understanding came with a price you now recognize. Staying silent here is not dramatic. It is steady. It is choosing not to rebuild what you dismantled just because the absence feels uncomfortable. What you are left with is not power in the theatrical sense. It is position. And position does not announce itself. It simply remains. What finally collapses in this phase is the fantasy that explanation was ever about connection. You begin to see that most explanations were transactions. You gave access. Others gave temporary comfort. You spoke. They relaxed. The exchange ended there. It rarely produced closeness. It produced relief. Relief is not intimacy. It is the absence of tension, and absence can be manufactured cheaply. When you stop explaining, you discover how few interactions were built on mutual presence rather than mutual regulation. Many conversations existed only to manage unease. You were the one doing the managing. You sensed discomfort and moved to resolve it. You bridged gaps that were not yours to bridge. You smoothed edges that were not threatening you. You became fluent in emotional labor and called it empathy. This realization is unsettling because it reframes your self-image. You may have believed you were generous, open, communicative. Those traits are not lies, but they were often misapplied. They were offered upward to people who benefited from your self-disclosure without offering reciprocity. Silence exposes this imbalance. Without your explanations, there is nothing to lean on. Those who leaned fall away. What replaces the noise is a stark quiet. In that quiet, you feel something unfamiliar, not loneliness exactly, more like absence of demand. No one is pulling at you. No one is asking for reasons. No one is probing your inner logic. The space is yours. At first it feels empty, because you are accustomed to filling it for others. Over time it begins to feel dense, like ground you can stand on. This density changes how you move. You stop orienting yourself toward reaction. You stop scanning faces for approval or concern. You stop adjusting mid-sentence. Your speech becomes slower, not because you are careful, but because you are no longer rushing to secure footing. You can afford pauses. You can afford to leave things unsaid. What is unsaid no longer feels like a liability. Others notice this shift before you do. They sense that you are less available for interpretation, less cooperative in the old way. They test boundaries unconsciously. They ask questions with no real purpose. They make comments designed to provoke clarification. When clarification does not come, they feel unsettled. That unsettlement reveals how much they depended on your transparency to feel oriented. At this point, some people will attempt to reassert control by reframing your silence as a flaw. They may call it passive. They may call it cold. They may call it confusing. These labels are not descriptions. They are strategies. They are attempts to reopen the channel of explanation by making you responsible for their discomfort. Accepting the label requires explanation. Refusing it requires nothing. The internal struggle here is sharp. You still care about being fair. You still value clarity. You still dislike unnecessary friction. But you now see that friction was often the only honest signal in the room. Removing it prematurely kept dynamics hidden. Silence allows them to surface. What surfaces is not always flattering, to you or to others. You begin to notice how often people speak to extract reassurance rather than exchange understanding. They want confirmation that things are okay, that they are okay, that their interpretation is valid. When you stop providing this, they must sit with their own uncertainty. Some cannot. They will pressure you to resume the old role. The pressure may be subtle. It may be framed as concern. It may sound like care, but it is still pressure. Resisting this pressure requires something most people were never taught: the ability to let others feel unsettled without rushing to fix it. This is not cruelty. It is restraint. It is the refusal to take responsibility for emotions you did not cause. The urge to fix is powerful because it once kept you safe. Now it keeps others comfortable at your expense. As this restraint strengthens, your sense of obligation shifts. You no longer feel obligated to be understood by everyone. You no longer feel compelled to clarify yourself to maintain harmony. Harmony built on your constant self-exposure is not harmony. It is dependency. Silence dissolves dependency. What remains is voluntary engagement or nothing at all. This is where the final illusions fall away. You see that many people did not know you. They knew your explanations. They knew the version of you filtered through justification and context. Without that filter, they are unsure how to relate. This is not because you became opaque. It is because they never learned to engage without leverage. The loneliness here is real, not dramatic, quiet. You are no longer surrounded by constant interaction, but what remains is cleaner. Interactions that persist do so without demand, without evaluation, without the expectation that you will account for yourself. These interactions feel heavier, slower, less frequent. They also feel real. At this stage, silence no longer feels like resistance. It feels like default. You do not think about withholding explanations. You simply do not produce them unless there is reason. That reason is no longer fear. It is alignment. Alignment with your own position rather than with the comfort of others. The reflex still appears occasionally. Old alarms sound in familiar situations, but now you recognize them as echoes, not commands. You can let them ring without obeying. The body learns slowly that nothing breaks when you do not explain, that the ground holds, that the threat was imagined. What is left is not a sense of triumph. It is clarity. You see how much of your past speech was unnecessary, how often words were used to manage perception rather than express reality. You see how silence could have preserved position where explanation dissolved it. This clarity changes how you listen as well. You notice when others explain too much, when they rush, when they justify. You see the same patterns you once lived inside. You feel no urge to correct them. Correction would require authority. Authority you no longer seek to exercise. You simply observe. And in that observation, a final truth settles in without announcement. You were never losing because you were wrong. You were losing because you kept stepping forward when stillness would have held. Silence is misunderstood because it is described incorrectly. People call it calm, restraint, maturity. Those words soften it. They make it sound benign. In reality, silence applied under pressure is aggressive to the nervous system of the person expecting response. It denies them resolution. It withholds the feedback loop they rely on to orient themselves. It forces them to sit inside uncertainty without assistance. That is not peace, it is pressure. Humans are not built to tolerate unreturned tension. When someone throws an implication into the room, they expect it to land somewhere. They expect it to be caught, answered, diffused, or escalated. Silence refuses all four. The implication hangs in the air, unfinished, like a question with no grammar. This incompleteness creates discomfort, and discomfort demands movement. If you do not move, they must. This is why silence feels violent to manipulators, not because it harms them directly, but because it removes their control over pacing. They can no longer steer the interaction. They can no longer predict outcome. They cannot tell whether their pressure worked. Uncertainty strips them of leverage. The longer the silence holds, the more exposed they feel. Exposure produces anxiety. Anxiety produces behavior. Stillness creates a vacuum. Not an empty one, but a charged one. Energy that would have been dissipated through your explanation now has nowhere to go. It rebounds. The person who initiated the tension begins to feel it inside their own body. They shift in their seat. They speak again, often unnecessarily. They clarify what they meant. They soften their tone. They offer context you did not ask for. They begin doing the work you once did. This reversal feels surreal the first time you witness it. You expect retaliation. You expect escalation. Instead, you see self-consciousness. The other person becomes aware of themselves. They hear their own words echo without confirmation. They wonder how they are being perceived. That wondering destabilizes them because it introduces self-evaluation. The judge becomes the defendant without a word being spoken. Silence also disrupts scripts. Many people operate from rehearsed patterns. They know what comes next because it has always come next. Accusation followed by explanation, pressure followed by reassurance. When the script breaks, they falter. They do not know their lines. They fill the gap poorly. This is not because they are foolish. It is because repetition creates dependence. Silence reveals that dependence brutally. The key detail is effect. Silence paired with agitation reads as weakness. Silence paired with neutrality reads as dominance. The difference is internal, not performative. Neutral effect communicates that nothing is wrong for you, that the tension exists elsewhere, that you are not compelled to resolve it. This is what makes silence oppressive to those who expected reaction. It tells them the pressure failed. Pressure that fails does not disappear. It turns inward. The manipulator begins defending themselves. They explain their intentions. They justify their question. They backpedal. Sometimes they laugh. Sometimes they grow irritated. All of these are signs of the same thing. Loss of frame control. Silence did not attack them. It forced them to confront their own move without support. This is why silence must be clean. No sighs. No facial commentary. No defensive posture. Anything that signals internal disturbance leaks relief back to them. They sense that the silence is strained. Strained silence reassures them that pressure is working. Clean silence does the opposite. It communicates that the pressure has nowhere to attach. There is a cruelty to this that people resist acknowledging. Silence makes others uncomfortable on purpose. Not sadistic discomfort, but structural discomfort. It removes the safety of predictable exchange. It forces the other person to manage their own emotional output. That management was previously outsourced to you. Taking it back feels like abandonment to them. This is why silence collapses aggression. Aggression relies on reaction. It needs resistance or submission to define itself. Silence offers neither. Without resistance, there is nothing to fight. Without submission, there is nothing to dominate. The aggressor floats without reference. Floating produces panic. You will notice that truly confident people do not use silence theatrically. They do not glare. They do not smirk. They do not posture. They simply do not respond. Their stillness feels heavy because it is unforced. It is not a tactic. It is a state. That state communicates something unspoken but unmistakable. This does not require explanation. What most people fear is that silence will escalate conflict. Sometimes it does. But escalation reveals intent. Someone who escalates because you did not explain exposes their need for control. They show their hand. Someone who backs down reveals that their pressure was performative. Either outcome is preferable to the fog produced by explanation. Fog hides intent. Silence reveals it. The most dangerous aspect of silence is how final it feels. Words can be revised. Explanations can be adjusted. Silence stands as it is. It cannot be edited. It communicates position without appeal. This finality is what terrifies those who rely on endless dialogue to maintain influence. Dialogue keeps things fluid. Silence sets weight. Once you experience this, silence no longer feels passive. It feels like a force. Not loud, not dramatic, dense. It occupies space without asking permission. It bends interactions by refusing to move within them. The other person must move instead. This is the stage where many realize that silence is not the absence of action. It is the refusal to absorb what was never yours. It is psychological violence only in the sense that it returns pressure to its source without dilution. And once pressure learns that you will not carry it, it stops being offered so freely. Not because people become kinder, but because systems adapt. They seek efficiency. Silence is inefficient for those who depend on reaction. The room changes when you do not speak, not outwardly, internally. The air thickens, someone swallows, someone shifts, someone fills the gap, and you remain where you are. Stillness is not empty, it is loaded. When you stop reacting, you remove the familiar landmarks that guide other people's behavior. Most interactions rely on micro-confirmations, nods, clarifications, emotional mirroring. These signals tell others where they stand. Silence removes those signals. The other person suddenly has no feedback. They do not know whether they are being understood, resisted, dismissed, or simply ignored. That uncertainty is intolerable for anyone accustomed to control. The human nervous system seeks closure. It wants loops completed. When you withhold response, the loop remains open. The tension that was meant to travel outward has nowhere to go. It stays active. The body looks for a release. This is why people begin to talk more when faced with silence. They are not adding information. They are trying to end discomfort. Their speech becomes self-directed rather than strategic. Watch closely what happens next. The tone shifts. The original edge dulls. The accusation softens into explanation. What was once implied as fault becomes reframed as misunderstanding. They may say they did not mean it that way. They may qualify. They may apologize. None of this is planned. It is the nervous system scrambling to restore equilibrium in the absence of cooperation. This is why silence is experienced as pressure rather than absence. It forces the other person into a position of self-regulation. They must manage their own emotional output instead of outsourcing it to you. Many people have never practiced this. They are used to reactions smoothing the way. When reactions disappear, their internal noise becomes audible. There is a moment in this process where the power dynamic flips completely. It is quiet, almost imperceptible. The other person begins monitoring themselves. Their words slow. Their posture changes. They look for signs from you and find none. This lack of confirmation destabilizes their sense of authority. Authority depends on acknowledgement. Without it, it decays. This is why silence works, even when nothing is said afterward. The effect occurs in the gap. The gap is where interpretation shifts. The person who initiated pressure expected to shape the interaction. Instead, they are shaped by it. Their own move becomes visible to them without distraction. Visibility creates self-consciousness. Self-consciousness interrupts dominance. Many people mistake this moment for victory. It is not. It is simply the system correcting itself once interference is removed. You did not overpower anyone. You stopped absorbing their force. The redirection happened naturally. This distinction matters because it keeps silence clean. Clean silence is stable. Performative silence leaks intent. The body language during this phase is revealing. Those who relied on manipulation often fidget. They lean forward, then back. They oversmile. They fill space with words that explain nothing. Those who relied on passive authority grow irritated. Irritation is a response to lost control. It attempts to provoke reaction through emotional charge. If reaction arrives, the old pattern resumes. If it does not, irritation exhausts itself. The longer you hold still, the clearer the landscape becomes. You begin to see how much of social interaction is built on borrowed energy. People feed off reactions. They use them to calibrate tone, timing, and dominance. Silence denies this fuel. Without it, behavior becomes raw, less strategic, more honest. This honesty is uncomfortable. It reveals insecurities. It exposes uncertainty. It strips away the polish of confidence that explanation once supported. When someone can no longer rely on your responses to stabilize themselves, their true position surfaces. Some shrink, some escalate, some disengage entirely. Each response is information you could never have accessed through dialogue. The temptation here is to rescue them, to soften the moment, to speak so that things feel normal again. This urge comes from habit, not empathy. You were trained to manage discomfort. Letting it exist feels wrong. But discomfort is not harm. It is friction. Friction reveals shape. Those who can tolerate this friction without moving occupy a different position entirely. They are not above others. They are not below. They are outside the loop that requires constant exchange to function. This outside position feels strange because it lacks the familiar rhythm of response. It also feels solid because nothing pulls at it. Silence held long enough changes how people approach you afterward. They choose words more carefully. They test less. They assume less access, not out of fear, but out of recalibration. Their nervous system has learned that pressure does not travel through you. Systems adapt to resistance they cannot overcome by bypassing it. This is the part most people never reach. They break silence too early. They relieve the pressure before it does its work. They confuse the discomfort of holding still with danger. They speak to end the feeling. By doing so, they reset the system. Nothing changes. Those who endure discover something unexpected. The silence does not need to be maintained forever. Once the system adjusts, the pressure stops being applied. There is nothing to hold. Interactions simplify. Fewer implications are thrown your way. Fewer tests appear. Silence becomes unnecessary because the environment has recalibrated around your stillness. This is not because others respect you more consciously. It is because their bodies have learned that certain behaviors produce no result. They move on to environments where reaction is available. You become inefficient to manipulate. Efficiency governs behavior more than morality ever will. The final realization of this stage is subtle. You understand that silence did not create power. It revealed where power was always leaking from. You were the conduit. When you closed it, the current stopped flowing. And in that stoppage, something settles. Not calm, not dominance, stability. Silence does more than return pressure. It reorganizes memory. People remember interactions not as transcripts but as sensations. When you stop explaining, the sensation attached to you changes. You are no longer associated with relief. You are associated with weight. Weight lingers. Relief evaporates. This is why silence leaves a stronger imprint than any argument ever could. Most people are accustomed to encounters that resolve quickly. Tension appears. Words are exchanged. Equilibrium returns. Silence interrupts this cycle. The encounter does not resolve in the expected way. It remains open. Open loops stay active in memory. The mind revisits them. The body rehearses them. You occupy more mental space precisely because you did less. This is the opposite of how people believe attention works, but it is how it actually works. When you explained, people left interactions feeling settled. They had closure. Closure allows dismissal. They could categorize you and move on. Silence denies categorization. You become harder to place. Hard to place elements demand attention. They are re-evaluated. Re-evaluation shifts hierarchy quietly, without confrontation. This is why those who rely on dominance often resent silence long after the moment has passed. They cannot articulate why. Nothing overt happened. No challenge was issued. Yet something unresolved remains. That unresolved feeling is the loss of narrative control. They do not know what story to tell themselves about you. Stories are how people maintain internal order. Silence disrupts story-making. Notice how, after a silent interaction, people often talk about you to others, not to attack you necessarily, but to process the ambiguity. They ask what you meant. They speculate. They replay the moment. This social processing is an attempt to rebuild the narrative you refuse to supply. In doing so, they reveal dependence. If you had explained yourself, none of this would be necessary. Silence creates work for others. Work signals gravity. This is also where fear enters for those who depend on influence. Influence requires predictability. Silence removes it. You become a variable they cannot solve. They do not know how to push you. They do not know what lever moves you. Uncertainty reduces attempts. Attempts that fail teach caution. Caution becomes distance. Distance becomes respect, though it is rarely named as such. Respect here does not mean admiration. It means restraint. People restrain themselves around those they cannot read easily, not because they are impressed, but because missteps feel costly. Silence increases the perceived cost of miscalculation. The cost is not retaliation, it is exposure. Exposure to one's own motives without cover. As this pattern repeats, you notice fewer provocations, fewer casual challenges, fewer implications disguised as curiosity. The environment changes, not because you asserted boundaries verbally, but because your silence made certain behaviors inefficient. Systems adapt to efficiency. They abandon strategies that yield no return. This is why silence is often described as intimidating. Not because it is aggressive, but because it removes reassurance. Many people move through life reassured by reactions. Nods tell them they are aligned. Clarifications tell them they are understood. Disagreements tell them where the line is. Silence tells them nothing. Nothing feels like danger to a nervous system trained on feedback. There is a deeper layer to this. Silence also disrupts self-deception. When you explain, you often explain yourself into believing the situation is resolved. You accept the relief as evidence that nothing important happened. Silence denies you that relief as well. You feel the tension too. You must sit with it. This forces you to confront what actually occurred. Not the words, but the move, the attempt at control, the bid for authority, the subtle aggression. In this way, silence sharpens perception on both sides. It prevents premature closure. It keeps dynamics visible long enough to be understood. This is why silence feels dangerous. It does not anesthetize, it exposes. Over time, this exposure trains discernment. You learn to recognize which interactions deserve words, and which deserve none. Not every question requires an answer. Not every accusation requires acknowledgement. Not every misunderstanding requires correction. Correction is optional. Position is not. People who master this do not become mute. They become selective. Their words gain value because they are no longer automatic. Automatic speech is cheap. It signals reflex. Selective speech signals agency. Agency is felt immediately. It changes how others orient toward you. There is a moment, subtle but decisive, when silence stops feeling like an act and starts feeling like default. You no longer count seconds. You no longer manage your face consciously. You simply do not respond when there is nothing to respond to. The body stops bracing. The nervous system learns that stillness does not equal danger. This learning is slow, but once integrated, it is permanent. At this point, silence ceases to be a tool. It becomes a condition. You are no longer withholding explanations. You are no longer resisting speech. You are simply not compelled. Compulsion is gone. That absence is felt by others as certainty, even if you never intended to communicate it. This certainty does not announce itself. It does not seek recognition. It does not need to be understood. It exists quietly, shaping interactions before they begin. People approach differently. They speak more carefully. They test less. They assume less access. They adjust without instruction. What you begin to see is that silence does not need to be defended. Defending silence would be a contradiction. Defense re-enters the courtroom. Silence that explains itself is no longer silence. It is another performance. True silence leaves no trace of justification. It does not ask to be interpreted correctly. It stands. The final shift in this stage is internal. You stop measuring yourself by how well interactions go. You stop judging success by smoothness. Smoothness often meant submission. You begin valuing clarity over comfort, position over peace. This does not make you hostile, it makes you precise. Precision feels cold to those accustomed to warmth generated by over-communication. But warmth produced by self-erasure was never warmth. It was friction management. Real warmth does not require you to disappear. Silence allows you to remain present without being consumed. It preserves you as a fixed point, rather than a responsive surface. Others move around that point. Some draw closer. Some move away. Both movements are honest. And honesty, once introduced, changes the geometry of every room you enter. Silence begins to expose something else. That explanation always concealed. The speed at which people assign motive. When you explained yourself, you guided interpretation. You filled in gaps. You shaped how others understood your actions. Without explanation, those gaps remain. People rush to fill them anyway. What they fill them with is not truth, it is projection. Projection is automatic. It is how the mind resolves ambiguity. When information is missing, it substitutes internal content, beliefs, fears, desires. When you stop explaining, you become a mirror. Others see themselves reflected back at them, and most do not like what they see. This discomfort is often mistaken for distrust. In reality, it is self-recognition. This is why silence polarizes. Some people assume the best. Others assume the worst. Their assumptions tell you nothing about you. They tell you everything about them. Explanation previously protected people from this exposure. It gave them a ready-made narrative, so they did not have to confront their own interpretive habits. Silence removes that protection. You will notice that those who react most strongly to your silence are those who relied most heavily on projection. They were comfortable as long as you confirmed their interpretations. When confirmation disappears, their internal noise becomes audible. They accuse you of being unclear. What they mean is that you are no longer validating their story. This stage is dangerous because it tempts you to reassert control over how you are perceived. You see false assumptions forming. You hear stories being told. You feel the urge to correct them. That urge is old. It comes from the belief that misinterpretation is harmful. Sometimes it is. Often it is merely uncomfortable. The distinction matters. Correcting projection does not eliminate it. It trains people to project more carefully next time. It teaches them that you will rescue them from their own assumptions. Silence forces them to sit with uncertainty. Some will learn, others will leave. Both outcomes reduce noise. Projection also reveals power asymmetries. Those who feel entitled to your explanations assume their interpretation matters more than your position. They believe you owe them clarity. That belief is itself a claim to authority. Silence denies it without confrontation. The claim collapses on contact. As this pattern repeats, you begin to see how often explanation functioned as reputation management. You curated how others saw you because you believed their perception determined your standing. Silence tests that belief. You discover that standing does not require consensus, it requires coherence. You must be aligned with yourself, even if others are not aligned with you. This alignment feels lonely at first because it removes the constant feedback that once reassured you. You are no longer checking yourself against reactions. You are no longer adjusting in real time. You act, and the act stands. Reactions happen later, elsewhere, or not at all. This delay is unsettling until you realize it is also freeing. People who depend on influence often respond to this delay with escalation. They push harder, they speak louder, they demand answers. This escalation is not strength, it is panic. Silence has removed their ability to steer. They are trying to force movement. If you move, they regain control. If you do not, they exhaust themselves. There is a moment when you recognize that explanation was never neutral. It always served someone. Often it served the loudest voice. Often it served the loudest voice. Often it served the most anxious interpretation. Often it served the person least willing to sit with ambiguity. Silence reverses this economy. It rewards patience. It privileges restraint. It disadvantages entitlement. The longer you maintain this posture, the more interactions simplify. You stop attracting people who thrive on interrogation. You stop feeding dynamics that require constant clarification. You become less interesting to those who need reaction and more solid to those who do not. Solid is not exciting, it is reliable. Reliability is what remains when performance is removed. There is a subtle grief here. You realize how much of your social world was built on misunderstandings you were constantly correcting. Those misunderstandings kept conversations alive. They created drama. They generated energy. Silence drains that energy. What remains is quieter. Some will find it boring. Some will find it grounding. Your preference becomes clear. This stage also clarifies when speech is actually necessary. True misalignments surface cleanly. Real conflicts reveal themselves. When someone has standing, silence feels inappropriate. You speak then, not to defend, but to decide. The difference is unmistakable. Decision carries no urgency. Defense always does. The body learns this distinction slowly. The old reflex still fires occasionally. But now, when it fires, it feels obvious. You recognize the familiar tightening, the urge to explain, the imagined threat. You see it as a memory, not a command. You can let it pass. Letting it pass becomes easier each time. What ultimately changes is how you experience accusation. Accusation no longer feels like a call to action. It feels like information. Someone is attempting to place you. Their attempt may succeed or fail. Your job is not to help them. Your job is to remain where you are. This is not apathy. It is refusal to misplace responsibility. You are not responsible for how others interpret you unless you choose to be. Choice replaces reflex. That replacement is the real shift. Silence does not make you invulnerable. It makes you uncooperative with dynamics that require your submission. Those dynamics still exist. They simply stop working on you. Like tools without a surface to grip, they slide off. By now, you no longer wonder whether silence is effective. You have seen it reorganize rooms, memories and relationships. You have watched people reveal themselves without you saying a word. You have felt the difference in your body when you do not rush to repair meaning. The danger at this stage is complacency. Silence is not a shield you carry everywhere. It is a condition you return to when pressure appears. It must remain clean. The moment it is used to posture, it loses weight. The moment it is explained, it dissolves. You do not announce silence. You do not threaten with it. You do not justify it. You let it exist as the absence of reaction where reaction was expected. And in that absence, the final illusion breaks. You realize you were never controlling how you were perceived through explanation. You were only controlling how much of yourself you surrendered in the attempt. At this point, the pressure no longer arrives the way it used to. It becomes subtler, more indirect. People sense that direct accusation no longer works, so they change tactics. They ask questions that pretend to be curious. They offer concern disguised as care. They make observations that carry an implied request for clarification. These moves are quieter, but they serve the same purpose. They are attempts to re-enter the old channel. What changes now is your internal response. Earlier, silence required effort. It felt like holding something back. Here, silence feels natural. The impulse to answer still appears, but it no longer dominates. You recognize the move beneath the words. You see that nothing real is being asked. There is no decision to make. There is only an invitation to explain. You do not accept it. This refusal has a compounding effect. People begin to self-edit around you. They sense that vague implications fall flat, that fishing questions yield nothing. They either speak plainly or not at all. This is not because you demanded clarity. It is because ambiguity without response feels exposed. Those who rely on ambiguity retreat. Those who do not become clearer. Silence at this stage does not escalate tension, it reorganizes it. The tension moves away from you and settles where it originated. The other person must either own what they are doing or abandon it. Ownership requires courage. Abandonment requires humility. Many choose neither. They disengage. Disengagement is not loss. It is filtration. This is where many people misinterpret what is happening. They believe they are becoming distant or isolated. In reality, they are becoming less available to low-value interaction. The noise drops. The volume of engagement decreases. The quality increases. This shift is uncomfortable because it contradicts social conditioning that equates quantity of interaction with connection. You begin to notice how often conversation was used as a substitute for position. People talk to feel relevant. They probe to feel involved. They question to feel powerful. Silence removes these compensations. Without them, some people have nothing to offer. This is not your responsibility to fix. There is also a change in how conflict presents itself. When it is real, it is direct. It does not hide behind implication. It does not require decoding. Those who have standing speak plainly. They do not need leverage. They state terms. Silence is no longer appropriate in those moments. You respond then, not to defend, but to choose. The clarity of these moments is striking compared to the fog that once surrounded everything. This distinction sharpens your judgment. You no longer confuse discomfort with danger. You no longer mistake curiosity for entitlement. You no longer assume every raised eyebrow is a problem to solve. Problems reveal themselves when left alone. Manufactured tension collapses when it is not fed. At this stage, something irreversible settles in. You no longer feel flattered by attention that comes through pressure. You no longer feel obligated to maintain harmony through self-exposure. You do not experience silence as withdrawal. You experience it as alignment. Your words, when they come, are no longer compensatory. They are deliberate. Others feel this difference immediately, though they may not name it. They sense that you are no longer operating on reflex, that you are not pulled by the same strings. This produces two reactions. Some respect it and adjust. Others resent it and leave. Both outcomes simplify your world. There is also a quiet shift in self-respect. Not pride, not confidence. A steadiness that comes from not betraying your position to relieve momentary discomfort. You remember how often you spoke to escape tension, rather than because speech was necessary. That memory no longer shames you, it instructs you. You see it clearly and choose differently. Silence here is no longer an act of resistance. It is simply the absence of unnecessary movement. You do not brace. You do not prepare. You do not rehearse explanations in your head. The mind grows quieter because it is no longer scanning for threats that demand verbal response. This quiet is not emptiness. It is space reclaimed. In that space, you notice how often others fill silence with their own truths. They reveal motivations they once hid behind questions. They disclose insecurities they once masked with authority. They expose limits they once obscured with confidence. None of this required interrogation. It required only that you not intervene. This is why silence is feared. It turns the spotlight inward. It removes distraction. It denies people the ability to define themselves through your reaction. They must face themselves without reflection. Not everyone is willing to do that. Those who are not will avoid you. That avoidance is not rejection, it is avoidance of exposure. The final adjustment at this stage is subtle but decisive. You stop measuring interactions by how they feel in the moment. You measure them by how they shape position over time. Immediate comfort loses its appeal. Long-term solidity becomes the metric. This shift changes everything. It removes urgency from speech. It removes anxiety from silence. You no longer rush to close loops. You allow them to close on their own or remain open indefinitely. Open loops no longer threaten you. They threaten only those who need resolution to feel safe. That need is no longer yours. By now, the old reflex feels distant, familiar but weak. It appears occasionally, like a phantom sensation. You recognize it and let it pass. There is no battle, no suppression, just non-participation. The reflex starves without drama. What remains is not dominance. It is position held without effort. You are no longer trying to control how others see you. You are no longer explaining to manage interpretation. You are simply present, unmoved by implication, uninterested in justification. The most telling sign of this shift is how little you think about it. Silence has become unremarkable. It no longer feels like a choice. It feels like gravity. It operates whether you notice it or not. And once gravity is established, things arrange themselves accordingly. What becomes visible now is how much speech was confession, not of guilt, but of vulnerability. Every time you defended yourself, you revealed what mattered to you. Every clarification exposed a value. Every justification illuminated a wound. You thought you were protecting yourself. You were mapping yourself. Anyone paying attention learned exactly where to press. Words betray priorities. You explain most where you are least secure. You defend most what you fear losing. You clarify most what you believe can be taken from you. Silence reveals none of this. It offers no map, no landmarks, no pressure points. This is why silence is not merely absence of weakness. It is denial of intelligence to the observer. When you spoke freely, people did not need to guess. They learned your ethics, your anxieties, your self-concept. They learned which labels offended you and which accusations hurt. They learned what you would tolerate and what you would rush to correct. This information made interaction efficient for them, dangerous for you. Frame warfare is not about winning arguments. It is about deciding what is being argued at all. The moment you defend, you accept the frame that something is wrong, questionable, or incomplete. You agree that evaluation is appropriate. From there you can only lose degrees, not win ground. You are negotiating inside a box someone else drew. Silence refuses the box. It does not counter the frame, it ignores it. Ignoring a frame is more destabilizing than opposing it, because opposition confirms relevance. Silence denies relevance entirely. The frame floats without anchor. The person who introduced it must now support it alone or abandon it. This is why high-status figures rarely clarify intent. Intent is irrelevant to position. Action stands on its own. Clarifying intent invites interpretation. Interpretation invites judgment. Judgment invites hierarchy. Those who understand this speak in outcomes, not explanations. They let others speculate. Speculation costs them nothing. Amused detachment emerges naturally here, not as a tactic but as a byproduct. When you are no longer invested in correcting perception, misinterpretation loses its sting. You watch assumptions form and dissolve without intervening. This reads as confidence to observers because confidence is simply lack of urgency. Urgency is the sound of something slipping. Detachment is often mistaken for indifference. It is not. It is precision. You care about what matters. You no longer care about what does not. Speech becomes a scarce resource. Scarcity increases value. Each word now carries intent rather than defense. The absence of filler sharpens everything. People sense this shift immediately. Conversations around you change. Fewer hypotheticals, fewer probes, fewer casual challenges. Those who once tested boundaries find nothing to test. Those who sought reassurance find none offered. Those who wanted reaction move elsewhere. The environment simplifies without effort. What is unsettling is how obvious this was in retrospect. You realize how often you talk to protect an image rather than state reality. How often you softened truth to preserve harmony that did not benefit you. How often you exposed yourself to avoid momentary discomfort. That exposure was never neutral. It was leverage handed over. Silence removes leverage by removing material. No material, no manipulation, no confession, no exploitation, no defense, no prosecution. This is not about being secretive. Secrets imply something to hide. Silence implies nothing. It simply does not participate in unnecessary exchange. Frame warfare ends when you stop fighting frames. You do not replace one narrative with another. You let narratives starve without input. They collapse. People move on. They always do. Attention follows reward. Reaction is reward. Silence is not. At this stage, you notice a final inversion. Those who once felt large around you now feel cautious. Those who once dominated conversations now listen more. Those who once interpreted now hesitate. This is not intimidation. It is recalibration. The system has learned that old strategies yield no return. You also notice how rarely you need to assert yourself now. Assertion invites resistance. Position does not. When you remain still, others adjust. When adjustment fails, disengagement follows. Both outcomes preserve you. Neither requires effort. There is a temptation here to believe you have mastered something. That belief would be premature. Mastery implies control. What you have learned is restraint. Restraint is not power exercised. It is power conserved. Conserved power does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly. The most telling change is internal. You no longer rehearse conversations in advance. You no longer anticipate accusations. You no longer plan defenses. The mind stops spinning because it is no longer preparing to be judged. Preparation was a sign of captivity. Its absence is freedom, though it feels plain. Plainness is deceptive. It hides weight. Others feel it without understanding it. They cannot place you easily. You do not fit into their scripts. This discomfort leads them to simplify their approach or avoid you. Both outcomes reduce friction. You begin to understand why those at the top speak so little. Not because they are mysterious, but because mystery is the natural state when nothing is offered unnecessarily. They do not cultivate opacity. They simply do not dilute themselves. Dilution was the cost of explanation. Each word spread you thinner. Silence gathers you back into one place. That place becomes difficult to move. The final realization of this stage is not triumphant. It is sobering. You see how much damage was done not by enemies but by your own mouth. How often you surrendered ground without being asked. How often you trained others to question you by answering reflexively. Seeing this does not make you bitter. It makes you exact. Exact with words, exact with access, exact with who is allowed to place you and who is not. From here on, speech becomes a decision rather than a reflex. Decisions carry no panic. They carry no rush. They do not seek approval. They simply occur. And when you do speak now, it is no longer to defend yourself. It is to define the world as it is and leave it there. Once speech becomes deliberate, another shift takes place that most people never experience. You realize how much language was used to negotiate status rather than convey meaning. Words were currency. You spent them to buy safety, approval, alignment. When you stop spending reflexively, you notice how desperate many exchanges actually are. Everyone is trading phrases, tone, explanation, reassurance, all trying to secure position without admitting that position is what they want. This is where many discover that their voice was never neutral. It was always angled. It leaned toward safety. It bent toward acceptance. It curved around perceived authority. Now, without that bend, your speech straightens. Straight speech feels harsh to those accustomed to curvature. They mistake it for aggression. It is not. It is unprotected reality. Silence exits this market entirely. It does not bid. It does not counteroffer. It does not compete. It waits. Waiting collapses artificial hierarchies. Because hierarchy built on exchange requires participation. When you do not play, the game exposes itself as optional. Those still playing feel uneasy around someone who is not. At this stage, accusations begin to change shape. They grow abstract. Instead of targeting actions, they target tone. Instead of questioning decisions, they question attitude. You are told you seem cold, distant, unapproachable. These are not critiques. They are symptoms. They indicate that access has been reduced, and the other person does not know how to re-establish it. Tone accusations are particularly revealing. They arise when content can no longer be challenged. If what you say stands, attention shifts to how you say it. This is another attempt to reinstall the courtroom. Tone is subjective. Subjectivity invites interpretation. Interpretation invites authority. Silence neutralizes this by refusing to engage with tone policing. You do not correct it. You do not soften. You do not explain how you feel. You let the comment hang. What happens next is instructive. Either the person clarifies their concern, revealing actual substance, or they retreat into vagueness. Vague pressure cannot survive without response. It needs reaction to feel real. Without it, it collapses into awkwardness. Awkwardness is not your burden. It belongs to the person who introduced ambiguity without intent. Detachment does not mean disengagement. It means non-identification. You no longer identify with accusations, interpretations, or projections. They pass through without sticking. When nothing sticks, nothing accumulates. When nothing accumulates, there is nothing to defend. Defense requires a build-up of threat. Detachment dissolves threat before it takes form. This is also the stage where amused detachment becomes visible to others. Not laughter, not mockery, a lightness that comes from not being hooked. You see moves for what they are. You do not need to counter them. You observe them with interest rather than alarm. This shift is deeply unsettling to those who rely on emotional leverage. They cannot tell whether they have failed or whether something worse is happening. That uncertainty weakens them. People begin to speak more carefully around you. Not because you demanded it, but because carelessness no longer yields control. Carelessness relies on reaction. Reaction creates opportunity. Silence closes it. Without opportunity, behavior becomes cleaner. Cleaner behavior feels formal. Formality feels like distance. Distance feels like respect. Another illusion falls away here. The belief that being accessible makes you likable. Accessibility makes you usable. Likability built on use is conditional. When the use ends, so does the liking. Silence exposes this quickly. Those who valued you for availability drift away. Those who valued you for presence remain. Presence does not require explanation. You will notice that some people stop joking with you. Not because you cannot take a joke, but because jokes often carry testing energy. They probe boundaries. They invite reaction. Without reaction, the joke lands flat. Flatness discourages repetition. What remains are jokes shared in mutuality rather than dominance. The difference is immediate. This stage can feel stark. Your social world thins, conversations shorten, interactions become efficient. You speak less, others speak more or less depending on who they are. This is not isolation, it is filtration. The system is shedding relationships that were sustained by your compliance. You may feel the urge to repair this thinning, to reintroduce warmth through explanation, to reassure others that you are still the same. This urge is the last defense of the old economy. Giving in restores volume but not value. Resisting allows a different equilibrium to form, one with fewer transactions and more weight. Silence now functions as a baseline. Speech occurs only when it advances something real. Decisions, boundaries, outcomes. You no longer narrate your inner world for comfort. You no longer manage impressions preemptively. You let impressions form or not. Their formation does not alter your behavior. The most striking change is how rarely you are misunderstood now. Not because everyone understands you, but because misunderstanding no longer affects you. The anxiety that once accompanied it is gone. Without anxiety, there is nothing to correct. Without correction, misunderstandings either fade or reveal themselves as attempts at control. Both outcomes are acceptable. By this point, Silence is not something you deploy. It is something you inhabit. You do not think about it. You do not count seconds. You do not perform neutrality. You simply do not move when movement is unnecessary. This non-movement exerts pressure without effort. Those who still attempt to dominate grow obvious. Their moves are clumsy. They rely on implication, tone, insinuation. Without your cooperation, these tools look weak. You see them clearly and feel no need to respond. Clarity replaces vigilance. The environment adapts. It always does. People either rise to the level of directness required to engage with you, or they disengage. Both outcomes reduce noise. What remains is quieter, heavier, slower. You begin to understand that power was never about asserting yourself over others. It was about refusing to be moved by what did not deserve movement. Silence taught you this not as a concept but as a lived condition, and once lived, it does not leave. At this stage, a deeper discomfort emerges, one that explanation once kept buried. You begin to see how often people used morality as leverage. Words like respect, kindness, openness, communication were never neutral. They were tools. They framed compliance as virtue and resistance as defect. When you explained yourself, you were not just answering questions, you were proving you were good. Silence disrupts this moral economy. It refuses to participate in virtue-signaling rituals. You are no longer demonstrating your goodness through accessibility. This unsettles people who relied on those rituals to feel righteous. They may accuse you of lacking empathy, of being closed off, of changing for the worse. These accusations are not ethical judgments. They are withdrawal symptoms. You stopped feeding a system that rewarded you for self-exposure. What becomes clear is that morality was often a disguise for hierarchy. Those who felt entitled to your explanations cloaked that entitlement in concern. They framed their scrutiny as care. They called interrogation interest. Silence strips away this disguise. Without your participation, the moral language sounds hollow. It floats without substance. This is where many people experience an internal conflict. You still value ethics. You still care about being fair. But you see now that fairness does not require constant transparency. You realize that explaining yourself to satisfy moral pressure often benefited the least ethical actors. They used your openness to position themselves as arbiters of correctness. You were generous. They were strategic. The moment you stop responding to moralized pressure, the dynamic inverts. The person applying it must now justify their stance. Why do they need you to explain? Why do they need reassurance? Why do they need clarity? These questions hang unspoken, but they are felt. Moral authority collapses when it demands justification and receives none. You begin to notice how often people conflate discomfort with harm. Silence makes them uncomfortable, so they label it harmful. This is projection. Harm requires damage. Discomfort requires adjustment. Adjustment is not violence. It is friction against habit. Habits resist friction. They call it wrong. This is why silence is framed as passive-aggressive by those who relied on explanation. Passive aggression still centers reaction. True silence does not. It does not signal. It does not punish. It simply does not comply. Non-compliance is frightening to those who never expected it. The deeper truth that surfaces here is that explanation was a form of self-policing. You internalized external expectations and enforced them on yourself. Silence releases you from that duty. Without constant self-policing, your behavior becomes simpler. You act. You do not narrate. You do not apologize for existing in a way that is not optimized for others' comfort. This simplicity exposes another illusion. That being understood is a prerequisite for being respected. In practice, the opposite is often true. Those who insist on being understood invite debate. Debate invites challenge. Challenge invites erosion. Those who do not insist are taken as given. Taken as given is the foundation of authority. You also notice how often people attempt to extract emotional labor under the banner of communication. They want you to explain how you feel so they can position themselves comfortably around it. Silence denies them that map. They must orient themselves without it. Some cannot. They become anxious. They seek reassurance elsewhere. Others adapt. They learn to engage without entitlement. This stage is particularly isolating because it removes false intimacy. Many connections were sustained by mutual disclosure, without mutual standing. Explanation created the illusion of closeness. Silence reveals whether closeness was real or simply a shared habit of exposure. What remains after silence is either genuine or gone. You may feel a temptation to reintroduce explanation selectively to preserve certain relationships. Sometimes this is appropriate, but you now see the cost clearly. Explanation must be exchanged, not given. It must occur between equals, not upward. When you give it freely, it is taken as expected. When it is exchanged, it builds alignment rather than hierarchy. There is also a shift in how you experience criticism. It no longer feels like a test of worth. It feels like information about the critic. You do not rush to refute. You do not rush to accept. You observe. Observation keeps you outside the moral trap. You are no longer auditioning for approval. This detachment produces a strange calm, not the calm of indifference, but the calm of reduced internal conflict. You are no longer torn between being true and being acceptable. You choose truth without explanation. Acceptance becomes optional. People sense this and respond in predictable ways. Some escalate moral pressure, hoping shame will reopen the channel. Others soften, sensing resistance. Others disengage. Each response clarifies the relationship. Silence accelerates sorting. Sorting feels brutal. It is efficient. By now, you recognize that explanation was often a substitute for courage. It allowed you to remain liked while surrendering position. Silence demands courage because it risks misinterpretation without correction. That risk feels high only if you still believe perception controls outcome. Experience has taught you otherwise. The most unsettling realization here is that many people never wanted your truth. They wanted your compliance. Explanation delivered compliance disguised as honesty. Silence removes the disguise. What remains is either respect or withdrawal. Both are preferable to manipulation. You no longer ask yourself how you are being seen. You ask whether you are being moved. If you are not being moved, there is nothing to do. If you are being moved, you notice who applied the force. That awareness replaces anxiety. Anxiety came from confusion. Clarity dissolves it. This stage feels cold to those outside it. It is not. It is simply no longer warm in a way that burns you. You have stopped setting yourself on fire to prove you are good. What remains is not righteousness. It is coherence. Your actions align with your position. Your silence aligns with your boundaries. You are no longer split between what you do and what you must explain about it. And in that alignment, moral pressure loses its grip. It has nothing to hook into. What emerges now is a different kind of danger, one that explanation once kept hidden. You realize how many systems depend on your predictability, not kindness. Predictability. They relied on knowing how you would respond, how quickly you would clarify, how much access they would have to your reasoning. When that predictability disappears, systems destabilize, not dramatically, quietly, and quiet destabilization makes people nervous. Predictability is the backbone of soft control. You do not need force if you can anticipate reaction. You do not need authority if you can trigger explanation on cue. When you stop explaining, you break the feedback loop that made you legible in that way. You are no longer easy to move. This is where resistance begins to show itself more clearly. Some people respond by attempting to formalize control. They introduce rules, they cite norms, they reference expectations. These moves are not about order, they are about restoring certainty. Silence has removed the informal leverage they once enjoyed. Formal leverage is the next attempt. You feel the shift immediately. The language becomes procedural. The tone becomes official. This is escalation disguised as structure. What matters here is not the content of these moves, but their timing. They appear only after silence proves effective. They are reactions, not principles. This is how you know the pressure is real. You touched something structural. You disrupted a flow that benefited others. They are now trying to reassert it through different means. The temptation is to respond defensively, to explain your intentions, to reassure that you are not challenging authority. Doing so restores the old dynamic under a new banner. Silence remains the only move that does not feed the structure. Silence does not argue with rules. It exposes why they were invoked. When you do not respond, the formal pressure must stand on its own. It must justify itself without your cooperation. Often, it cannot. The rules were never meant to be examined. They were meant to be accepted. Silence invites examination without asking questions. That invitation is dangerous to brittle systems. At this stage, you also notice how often explanation functioned as a release valve for others' anxiety. You spoke so they could relax. You clarified so they could feel oriented. You defended so they could feel justified. Silence removes this service. Anxiety has nowhere to go. It either turns inward or finds a new outlet. Neither outcome involves you. This is where many people become angry. Not because you harmed them, but because you stopped regulating them. They feel abandoned by your stillness. They accuse you of withholding. Withholding implies obligation. Obligation implies hierarchy. Silence denies both without confrontation. Anger is an escalation attempt. It tries to provoke reaction through force when implication fails. If you respond emotionally, the system revives. If you respond verbally, the courtroom reopens. If you remain still, anger burns out quickly. Anger requires engagement. Without it, it collapses into embarrassment or retreat. You begin to see how rare genuine authority actually is. Most of what passes for authority is sustained by habits of compliance. When compliance ends, authority reveals itself as hollow or real. Real authority does not need your explanation. It does not seek reassurance. It does not provoke reaction. It issues decisions and accepts outcomes. Silence does not threaten it. This distinction becomes invaluable. You stop confusing noise with power, loudness with importance, pressure with legitimacy. Silence becomes a filter that separates substance from performance. Those who have standing speak plainly and move on. Those who do not circle, probe, and escalate, their behavior marks them. At this point, your relationship to fear changes. Fear no longer comes from accusation or misunderstanding. It comes from recognizing how much of your past behavior was shaped by the desire to be manageable. Manageable people are not respected. They are used. Silence removes manageability. That removal feels risky because it eliminates a familiar survival strategy. It also eliminates the need for it. You may notice a new kind of steadiness, not confidence. Confidence is loud internally. This steadiness is quiet. It does not need reinforcement. It does not spike when things go well, or crash when they do not. It comes from knowing that you will not betray your position to soothe discomfort. That knowledge changes how you inhabit space. Others feel this immediately. They sense that you are no longer negotiating your presence. You are simply there. This presence does not invite challenge. It does not invite intimacy either. It invites clarity. Those who want clarity approach directly. Those who wanted leverage withdraw. The final danger in this stage is overcorrection, using silence to punish, to withhold warmth deliberately. That turns silence into a weapon and reintroduces dependence on reaction. True silence does not aim, it simply does not move. Aimed silence still cares about effect. Unmoved silence does not. As this distinction settles, your behavior becomes simpler. You speak when there is something to decide. You remain silent when there is not. You do not track how this is received. Tracking would reintroduce performance. You let outcomes unfold without commentary. This is when silence stops being noticeable. It blends into your presence. People stop remarking on it. They adjust. The environment reshapes itself around your lack of response. The absence of explanation becomes unremarkable. That is the sign that the system has adapted. Adaptation is the goal, though it was never sought. You did not aim to dominate. You aimed to stop surrendering. The difference is critical. Dominance invites challenge. Non-surrender invites recalibration. By now, you no longer think about not defending yourself. Defense feels foreign. The impulse to justify arises occasionally, but it no longer carries authority. You recognize it as a relic, something that once served you and no longer does. What remains is a quiet vigilance, not scanning for threat, but awareness of movement. You notice when pressure appears. You notice when it fades. You do not chase either. You remain where you are. And in remaining, you understand something that explanation never allowed you to see. Most power does not come from action. It comes from refusing to be displaced. There is a point where the pattern completes itself, and what remains is exposure in its purest form. Not yours, theirs. Without your explanations, people are left with only their own behavior to account for. This is when the most revealing shifts occur. Conversations shorten, moves become blunt. The subtlety that once masked intent disappears. Without your participation, finesse is unnecessary. Those who relied on manipulation no longer bother hiding it. This is where frame warfare reaches its conclusion. Not through confrontation, but through exhaustion. The person who cannot move you eventually stops trying. Not because they accept you, but because the effort yields nothing. Influence without return is waste. Waste is abandoned. Silence teaches this faster than any rebuttal ever could. You begin to notice how much of the social world runs on frictionless extraction. People extract reassurance, validation, emotional labor, deference. Explanation made extraction smooth. Silence introduces resistance. Not overt resistance, but absence of yield. Without yield, extraction fails. Systems built on extraction collapse quietly. This collapse reveals a hard truth. Many people were never engaging with you. They were engaging with what you provided. When provision stops, engagement stops. This feels personal, until you realize it is structural. It is not about liking or disliking you. It is about access. Silence removes access without apology. There is a moment here where you feel a strange relief mixed with something colder. Relief because the noise is gone, cold because the illusion is gone with it. You see how transactional many interactions were, how often connection was conditional on your willingness to explain, soothe, or accommodate. Seeing this does not make you superior. It makes you cautious. Caution replaces optimism. You no longer assume goodwill. You observe behavior and let it speak. Behavior does not lie the way language does. Those who respect position do not press. Those who do not reveal themselves quickly when met with silence. You do not need to judge them. Their actions categorize them. This stage also changes how you experience power in others. You stop being impressed by confidence that demands reaction. You stop yielding to authority that needs explanation to function. Real authority does not require your compliance to feel real. It does not chase response. It does not escalate when ignored. Silence clarifies this distinction with brutal efficiency. What is unsettling is how little effort this requires once integrated. You are not strategizing. You are not calculating moves. You are simply not moving where movement is unnecessary. This non-movement does the work. It filters, it exposes, it reorganizes. People begin to describe you differently, though rarely to your face. They say you are hard to read, that you have presence, that conversations with you feel heavier. These descriptions are attempts to articulate the absence of familiar cues. They are not compliments or criticisms. They are observations of structural change. You may notice that fewer people ask you for advice now. Advice invites explanation. Advice invites authority. When you no longer explain yourself freely, others hesitate to request it. This is not loss. It is recalibration. Those who do ask now come with clarity. They want decisions, not reassurance. The difference is unmistakable. There is also a quiet shift in how you relate to your own thoughts. You stop narrating them internally as if someone else were listening. You stop preparing justifications for actions you have not taken. The internal courtroom dissolves. Without an imagined judge, the mind simplifies. Choices feel cleaner. Hesitation decreases. This simplification reveals how much mental noise was generated by the expectation of explanation. You were never thinking freely. You were thinking defensively. Silence externally produces silence internally. The mind no longer rehearses speeches that will never be given. That rehearsal was a form of submission to hypothetical authority. At this stage, many people feel a subtle grief for the version of themselves that explained everything. That version was earnest, well-intentioned, often generous. It believed explanation would protect it. Letting it go feels like letting go of innocence. But innocence was never the issue. Position was. You do not become cruel when you stop explaining. You become exact. Exact with who receives your words. Exact with when speech is necessary. Exact with when silence preserves more than speech ever could. Exactness feels cold to those who benefited from your warmth. It feels fair to those who did not need it. The environment responds accordingly. Fewer misunderstandings arise because fewer are manufactured. Fewer conflicts escalate because fewer are fed. When conflict does appear, it is real. It involves stakes. It involves decisions. It does not involve implication games. You engage then without anxiety because the ground is solid. This is where the idea of technique finally dissolves. There is no method left to apply. Silence is no longer something you do. It is something that happens naturally when there is nothing worth responding to. You do not feel virtuous for it. You do not feel powerful. You feel aligned. Alignment is the end state of frame warfare. When you are aligned, frames cannot be imposed. They slide off. They find no surface to adhere to. You remain in your position without asserting it. Others adjust or depart. Both outcomes confirm the same thing. You were never meant to explain yourself to remain safe. Safety purchased through explanation was conditional and fragile. What replaces it is not safety. It is solidity. Solidity does not require maintenance. By now you no longer wonder whether defending yourself ever helped. You have seen enough to know it did not. You have seen how silence resolved what words prolonged. You have watched pressure turn back on itself when denied passage. The final realization of this stage is quiet and complete. You understand that every explanation you once gave trained someone how to treat you. Every silence you now hold retrains the environment without instruction. Nothing needs to be said about this. It is already happening. Agreement is misunderstood because people assume it signals surrender. They confuse alignment of words with alignment of position. What actually happens when you agree without defense is far more unsettling. You remove resistance, and without resistance, force has nothing to push against. The attack continues forward and collapses under its own momentum. When someone accuses you and you answer with correction, you create opposition. Opposition stabilizes the aggressor. It gives them something solid to lean into. Agreement does the opposite. It denies them structure. They expected friction. They prepared for rebuttal. When you offer none, their move overshoots. The energy they released finds no surface and spills awkwardly into the open. This is why flat agreement feels disarming. Not enthusiastic agreement. Not apologetic agreement. Simple acknowledgement. You do not justify. You do not contextualize. You do not soften. You let the statement stand. The accuser now faces an unexpected problem. There is nothing left to do. The conflict they initiated cannot escalate because there is no counterforce to react to. This is not concession. Concession accepts inferiority. Agreement without defense accepts nothing beyond the literal words spoken. You do not accept implication. You do not accept character judgment. You accept only the surface statement and nothing underneath it. This precision is what makes it lethal. It strips the accusation of emotional leverage while leaving it technically unanswered. People rarely know what to do next. They may repeat themselves. They may add detail. They may attempt to clarify their accusation to provoke reaction. Each attempt reveals insecurity. They are trying to regain footing. They feel something has gone wrong but cannot name it. The rhythm they rely on has been disrupted. This kind of agreement feels dangerous to those who use language as control because it turns their words into caricature. The more they elaborate, the more exposed they become. Their seriousness dissolves. What was meant to intimidate now sounds inflated, excessive, slightly absurd, not because you mocked it, but because you refuse to legitimize it through resistance. There is also a subtle hierarchy shift here. When you do not argue, you imply that the accusation does not threaten you. Threatened people defend. Unthreatened people acknowledge and move on. This implication lands without explanation. It reframes the entire interaction. The one who accused now appears invested. You appear settled. Amplification works on the same principle. When an accusation is exaggerated beyond its original scope without emotional charge, it loses gravity. You do not ridicule it. You do not dramatize it. You extend it logically until its structure collapses. This extension is not sarcastic. It is literal. Literalness taken too far empties implication of power. Observers sense this immediately. They feel the shift before they understand it. The person attacking begins to sound unreasonable. You sound unmoved. Reasonableness flows towards stillness, not effort. The more someone pushes against non-resistance, the more effort they expend. Effort signals weakness. Calm signals position. Questions operate similarly when used without defense. When you answer accusation with inquiry, you are not seeking clarity. You are redirecting attention. The focus moves from you to the accuser, not aggressively, naturally. They are asked to define their claim, to specify, to own it. Many cannot. Their power depended on vagueness. Precision dismantles vagueness quietly. What matters here is tone. Everything hinges on neutrality. Agreement delivered with tension leaks submission. Agreement delivered with calm removes conflict entirely. This neutrality is not learned through technique. It comes from not caring about being understood. When understanding ceases to be a goal, tone settles naturally. You notice that these reversals do not feel like moves, they feel like absence of movement. You are not acting against someone, you are declining to play the role they assigned you. That refusal creates space where their behavior becomes visible. Visibility weakens manipulation more effectively than confrontation ever could. This is why people who master this appear slippery. Not because they evade, but because there is nothing to grab. Words slide off. Accusations fail to stick. Attempts to provoke feel wasted. The attacker grows tired. Tired people retreat or expose themselves further. Either outcome ends the exchange in your favor without you seeking victory. The key realization is that force does not need to be met with force. It needs to be met with emptiness. Emptiness does not mean silence alone. It means absence of resistance, absence of justification, absence of emotional engagement. When these are removed, the structure collapses on its own. By now you recognize that what looks like verbal skill is often restraint. The less you add, the more the other person reveals. The less you resist, the more unstable their position becomes. You are not overpowering them. You are letting gravity work. This is not something you deploy consciously. It emerges when you no longer feel compelled to correct, defend, or manage perception. You respond minimally or not at all. The response when it comes is simple, unadorned, free of intent. People accustomed to dominance find this infuriating because it denies them drama. Drama is how they establish relevance. Without it, they fade. Others watching feel the shift and adjust accordingly. They may not know why the interaction ended the way it did. They only know who seemed solid. What remains is not satisfaction, it is clarity. You see how often resistance created the very conflict you thought you were fighting. You see how often agreement without surrender dissolved it instantly. By refusing to push back, you allowed the push to fall, and in falling, it revealed that it was never supported to begin with. There is a moment when you realize that most attacks are not designed to win. They are designed to move you, to shift you off center, to force reaction. The content is secondary, the timing is everything. When you stop responding as expected, the attack reveals its true purpose. It was never about truth, it was about motion. Questions become weapons here, not sincere questions, loaded ones, questions that assume fault, incompetence, or obligation. They are structured to corner you into explanation. Explanation would place you beneath the questioner, scrambling to re-establish footing. When you do not answer in that way, the question hangs unanswered. Hanging questions create discomfort for the one who asked them, not the one who did not answer. This is where reversal occurs without effort. The person who asked now carries the weight of the silence. They must decide whether to repeat the question, clarify it, or abandon it. Repetition signals insecurity. Clarification signals retreat. Abandonment signals failure. None of these outcomes benefit them. All of them reveal something. You may respond with another question. Not to be clever, not to trap, simply to redirect attention. A question asked calmly returns scrutiny without accusation. It forces definition. Many questions used as weapons are intentionally vague. They rely on implication rather than substance. Asking for specificity strips them of force. The moment someone must define their claim, they must own it. Ownership is expensive. Most people avoid it. They prefer suggestion, tone, insinuation. Silence and simple questions demand ownership without hostility. This demand feels unfair to those accustomed to operating in ambiguity. They become flustered. They back away. They grow defensive. Defense reveals hierarchy inversion. The one who asked is now responding. This is why verbal exchanges collapse so quickly once you stop defending. The structure cannot sustain itself without your cooperation. You were never just participating, you were stabilizing it. Removing that stabilization causes rapid decay. What remains is raw intent exposed without camouflage. You begin to notice how often people escalate when they feel control slipping. They speak faster, they add qualifiers, they raise their voice slightly, they introduce unrelated details. These behaviors are not strength, they are signs of loss. The body is trying to regain balance through movement. Stillness denies it that option. Agreement, amplification, questions, silence. None of these are techniques in isolation. They are manifestations of the same condition. You are not invested in outcome through speech. You are not trying to win. You are not trying to be understood. That lack of investment is what unravels the exchange. Observers feel this immediately. They may not understand why the dynamic shifted, but they sense who remains composed. Composure is contagious. It settles the room. The one who attacked now appears out of sync. Their energy feels excessive. Excess draws attention. Attention magnifies imbalance. This is where many people betray themselves. They cannot tolerate the imbalance they created. They rush to correct it. They laugh it off. They apologize. They soften. Each move is an attempt to restore equilibrium. You do nothing. The imbalance resolves on its own, always in the same direction. The more you witness this, the more obvious it becomes how unnecessary defense ever was. Defense assumed threat. Most threats were hollow. They relied on your fear of misinterpretation. Once that fear is gone, the threat dissolves before it takes shape. There is also a shift in how you hear language. You begin to hear moves instead of meaning. You hear when someone is fishing, when someone is posturing, when someone is probing for insecurity. This hearing is not analytical, it is immediate. The body recognizes patterns it once responded to automatically. Now it simply notes them. This noting changes everything. You no longer feel compelled to respond to every stimulus. You choose. Choice introduces pause. Pause introduces dominance without assertion. Dominance is simply the ability to remain unhurried while others rush. You may notice that some people accuse you of being evasive. Evasion implies something to hide. You are hiding nothing. You are declining to participate in a structure that benefits them. The accusation itself is another attempt to provoke explanation. You do not correct it. Correction would validate the frame. You let it stand. It withers. The most unsettling realization here is how easily dynamics flip when you remove just one element. You were taught that communication fixes problems. In many cases it creates them. Silence, agreement, and questions without defense remove the friction that fueled conflict. What remains is emptiness. Emptiness terrifies those who relied on noise to feel powerful. You also begin to see how rarely you need to say anything at all. Most interactions resolve themselves when you do not interfere. People reveal what they want, what they fear, what they are willing to do. You gather information without asking for it. Information arrives because the other person fills the space. This is the quiet advantage. Not that you outmaneuvered anyone, but that you stopped interrupting their exposure. They do the work for you. You simply observe. The final shift in this stage is internal acceptance. You accept that you do not need to appear correct. You do not need to appear calm. You do not need to appear anything. Appearance was the trap. The moment you stopped managing it, the trap closed on those who depended on it. What remains is not cleverness, it is stillness paired with awareness. Awareness without urgency, stillness without fear. And in that combination, every verbal attack loses its edge before it ever reaches you. What becomes clear now is that force was never verbal, it was psychological. Words were only the carrier. Once you stop responding as expected, the carrier arrives with no payload, it lands empty. This is when you see how much of language was used to simulate power rather than exercise it. Pulling force always defeats pushing, because pushing requires resistance to define itself. When someone pushes verbally, they are testing for something solid to press against. Defense provides that surface. Silence removes it. Agreement dissolves it. Questions redirect it. The force continues forward and collapses under its own weight. This collapse often looks awkward rather than dramatic. The attacker pauses. They repeat themselves. They smile strangely. They add a joke. These are not random behaviors. They are attempts to recover momentum. Momentum is everything in psychological exchanges. Once lost, it is difficult to regain without escalation. Escalation exposes intent. Exposure is costly. You begin to notice that people who rely on pressure rarely know what to do when it fails. They were trained to push, not to stand. Standing requires position. Pushing only requires motion. When motion is denied, they feel stranded. That stranded feeling produces self-consciousness. Self-consciousness dissolves dominance. This is why pulling force works without effort. You are not meeting them where they expect. You are not pushing back. You are not absorbing. You are simply not there in the way they anticipated. Their move lands in empty space. Empty space reflects nothing back. Reflection is how influence travels. Without reflection, it stops. At this stage, you also see how often people provoke just to feel alive in the interaction. They are not angry. They are bored. They seek reaction to generate energy. Explanation fed this. Defense energized it. Silence starves it. Starved behaviors do not persist. This is where many people misunderstand what is happening. They believe they are being passive. They believe they are letting things slide. They are not. They are refusing to generate energy for dynamics that thrive on it. This refusal is active, not inert. It is a choice not to power someone else's frame. You notice a shift in pacing. Conversations slow down around you. People hesitate before speaking. They choose words more carefully. They are no longer sure what will produce movement. This hesitation is often mistaken for respect. It is not admiration. It is recalibration. The environment is learning new rules. Those who adapt do so quietly. They become more direct. They state intentions plainly. They drop implication. They engage without games. Those who cannot adapt withdraw or escalate. Withdrawal is neutral. Escalation is revealing. Both outcomes clarify the landscape. There is a deeper layer here that most never reach. You begin to feel when force is being applied before words arrive. The body senses pressure in tone, timing, posture. You recognize the attempt before it forms into language. Because you recognize it early, you do not react late. Early recognition prevents entanglement. This is why true verbal Aikido does not feel like technique. It feels like absence of surprise. You are no longer startled by accusation or implication. Surprise was what triggered defense. Without surprise, there is no reflex. Without reflex, there is no submission. You also begin to see how often people try to provoke you into defining yourself. They want labels, positions, statements they can react to. Definition creates edges. Edges can be attacked. Silence leaves no edge. Undefined objects are difficult to grasp. People prefer certainty even when it harms them. You no longer provide it. There is a moment here where you realize that many conflicts were never conflicts. They were invitations to react. You accepted them unknowingly. Now you decline. Declining requires nothing more than stillness. The invitation expires on its own. This is why pulling force always wins. You are not opposing the other person. You are letting them move while you remain. Movement without counterbalance exhausts itself. Stillness endures. Observers sense this endurance. They see that nothing shakes you. Not because you are strong, but because you are not engaged in the same struggle. You are not trying to prove anything. Proof invites contest. Contest invites erosion. By now, you rarely feel the urge to explain even internally. The internal dialogue quiets. You do not rehearse responses. You do not imagine counterarguments. The mind stays where the body is, present, unmoved. This presence changes how time feels in interaction. Pauses stretch. Silence feels long to others. To you, it feels normal. This asymmetry gives you space. Space gives you options. Options do not need to be used to be valuable. You also notice how often others fill silence with truth. Not objective truth, but their truth. Their fears, their assumptions, their motives. They speak because they cannot tolerate the vacuum. The vacuum does the work. You receive information without asking. This is the final inversion of verbal conflict. The one who speaks most reveals most. The one who explains most exposes most. The one who remains still gathers. Gathering is not hoarding, it is orientation. You orient yourself in the environment without broadcasting your location. Broadcast invites interception. Silence preserves position. By now, you no longer think in terms of winning exchanges. The concept feels irrelevant. Exchanges end when energy runs out. Silence accelerates that end without force. What remains after the exchange is over is telling. You remain intact. The other person feels slightly diminished, not because you took anything, but because they spent something and received nothing in return. This asymmetry is not cruel. It is natural. It is what happens when pressure meets emptiness. And once emptiness proves immovable, pressure learns to go elsewhere. There is a final discomfort before this pattern becomes permanent, and it is internal. You begin to notice how much identity you once derived from being responsive, from being quick, from being sharp with words, from having the right answer ready. Silence removes that role. Without it, you are left without a familiar mirror. This feels like loss until you realize what was lost was performance, not self. Performance was rewarded. People praised you for being articulate, reasonable, communicative. Those praises trained you to speak even when speech weakened you. They taught you that verbal agility was strength. Silence dismantles that belief quietly. You begin to see how often verbal skill was used against you by those who lacked it. They pulled you into terrain where you overextended yourself and called it debate. Once you stop entering that terrain, something subtle changes. People who relied on verbal dominance feel exposed. Their advantage disappears. They can no longer provoke you into explaining your intelligence, your morality, your intentions. Without your participation, their skill has nowhere to land. They may accuse you of being dull or disengaged. These accusations are defensive. They are mourning the loss of leverage. This stage clarifies how deeply society confuses intelligence with talk. Silence is misread as absence of thought rather than containment of it. You let that misreading stand. Correcting it would require explanation. Explanation would re-enter the loop. You do not need to be seen as intelligent to be effective. You need to be unmoved. As this settles, your internal posture changes. You no longer feel compelled to fill space. Space stops feeling empty. It feels intentional. You begin to recognize that words were often used to avoid sitting with uncertainty. Silence forces you to sit. Sitting clarifies what matters. Most things that once demanded explanation fade when left alone. You also notice how rarely people actually want dialogue. They want confirmation. They want alignment. They want reassurance that their interpretation is valid. Silence denies this gently but firmly. Some respond by becoming more precise. others by disengaging. Precision improves interaction, disengagement removes noise. Both outcomes serve you. At this stage you may experience moments of temptation. A sharp comment arises, a perfect retort forms, the old pleasure of verbal dominance surfaces. You could dismantle the other person with words. You could win. You do not. Not because you cannot, but because you see the cost. Winning verbally still requires engagement. Engagement still feeds the structure. Silence ends it. This restraint feels like discipline, not imposed, chosen. You recognize that speech used as weapon corrodes position just as defense does. Both keep you inside the exchange. Remaining outside preserves you. You begin to understand why certain people rarely speak even when they could. Their silence is not ignorance. It is selectivity refined through experience. They learned that most battles are decided by participation, not outcome. Declining participation is the cleanest victory. There is also a shift in how you experience respect. It no longer arrives through praise or acknowledgement. It arrives through changed behavior. People interrupt you less. They probe less. They make fewer assumptions. These changes are subtle and cumulative. They matter more than words ever did. This stage also reveals how often you mistook familiarity for closeness. Familiarity was sustained through constant exchange. Silence reduces familiarity. What remains is either real connection or distance. Real connection survives without constant explanation. Distance clarifies boundaries. Both are honest. Your emotional range simplifies. You feel less irritation, less urgency, less need to correct. Not because nothing bothers you, but because fewer things reach you. Without constant stimulation from verbal conflict, your nervous system settles into a lower baseline. Calm becomes default rather than achievement. This calm changes how you perceive time. Interactions feel slower. Decisions feel less rushed. You allow things to unfold without intervention. This patience is not passive, it is observant. You watch patterns complete themselves without interference. Completion reveals outcomes more clearly than argument ever could. By now, silence is no longer a strategy you remember to apply. It is simply what happens when nothing requires action. The absence of action becomes meaningful because it is chosen rather than forced. You are not withholding, you are not suppressing, you are simply not compelled. People sense this lack of compulsion. It unsettles those who rely on urgency to move others. Urgency without response collapses. Those who do not rely on urgency feel comfortable around you. They speak plainly. They wait. They accept pauses. Interaction becomes sparse but real. The final realization of this stage is understated. You understand that explanation was never power. It was negotiation. Negotiation implied uncertainty. Silence implies certainty without declaration. Certainty does not need to be proven. It only needs to be held. Held certainty changes everything. It does not shout. It does not defend. It does not explain. It simply remains intact while others move around it. And in remaining, it outlasts every attempt to dislodge it. At this point, the pattern stops feeling tactical and starts feeling structural. You realize that most verbal force was never aimed at you as a person. It was aimed at your momentum, at your tendency to move, respond, correct, stabilize. Once that tendency is gone, the force loses direction. It drifts. Drift is fatal to pressure. You begin to notice that attacks now arrive malformed. They are shorter, less confident, often abandoned mid-sentence. People sense, even unconsciously, that their usual entry points are closed. They speak and then stop. They look for reaction and do not find it. The absence is disorienting. They retreat or overcompensate. Either way, the exchange ends quickly. This is where the illusion of verbal dominance finally collapses. Dominance depended on rhythm. Question, answer, push, resist, accuse, defend. Once the rhythm breaks, there is nothing to ride. The interaction loses tempo. Without tempo, it cannot sustain itself. It dissolves into stillness or awkward withdrawal. What becomes obvious now is that most people were never skilled. They were rehearsed. They memorized patterns that worked on compliant targets. When the target stops moving, rehearsal fails. Improvisation is required. Few can improvise without revealing themselves. Silence forces improvisation. You see this clearly in how quickly people contradict themselves once deprived of your responses. They add qualifiers. They reverse direction. They soften claims they made seconds earlier. These shifts are not strategic. They are nervous corrections. The body trying to regain balance without support. This is why pulling force always wins. You are not redirecting energy consciously. You are simply not absorbing it. The energy has to go somewhere. It goes back into the sender. That return is felt immediately. They experience it as doubt, embarrassment, or irritation. You experience it as nothing. The absence of internal reaction is the key difference now. Earlier, silence required effort. Now it does not. There is no internal debate about whether to speak. The urge arises faintly and passes. It does not hook you. Without internal movement, there is no external movement. You begin to understand that the real submission was not speaking. It was caring whether the other person believed you. That care created urgency. Urgency created vulnerability. Silence removes urgency. By removing the need to be believed, belief becomes irrelevant. Position remains. This stage also reveals how rarely people actually listen. When you explained, they waited for their turn. They listened for openings. They listened to respond. Silence denies them this structure. They must listen without payoff. Many cannot. They disengage. Disengagement is information. Those who remain speak differently. They state things plainly. They do not circle. They do not test. They accept pauses. These interactions feel heavy, not intense. Heavy because nothing is being carried unnecessarily. Each word matters. Each silence matters more. You may notice that your own language changes. When you do speak, it is brief, declarative, unconcerned with reception. You do not soften edges. You do not add cushioning. The words land or they do not. You do not follow them. This non-following is what most people find unsettling. They are used to feedback loops. They expect clarification. They expect adjustment. When none comes, they feel exposed. Exposure makes them cautious. Caution changes behavior faster than argument ever could. There is also a strange neutrality that settles into your body. Not numbness, not detachment. A sense that you are no longer leaning forward or backward. You are upright, balanced. This posture communicates itself without words. Others feel it and respond accordingly. By now, attempts to provoke you feel obvious before they are spoken. The body recognizes the setup. You feel no need to preempt it. Preemption would still be engagement. You let it arrive and pass. Most of the time, it never fully arrives. The other person senses the futility and stops. This is the final function of verbal aikido. Not reversal, but prevention. The exchange never forms. Without formation, there is nothing to dismantle. This is why it feels effortless now. Effort was required only while you were still invested in outcome. You also notice that you are no longer collecting victories. There is nothing to count, no moments to replay. The mind stops cataloging interactions because there is nothing unresolved. Resolution happens instantly through non-participation. This is unsettling in a different way. You lose the drama of triumph. You lose the satisfaction of having the right response. What replaces it is quiet continuity. Days pass without friction. Interactions end without residue. The nervous system rests. Rest reveals how much energy was once burned on unnecessary exchanges. That energy returns slowly. You feel less drained, less vigilant, less reactive. You do not attribute this to silence explicitly. You simply notice that life feels less crowded. People may still attempt to challenge you, but now the challenges feel hollow. They lack conviction. They lack follow-through. They sense that you are not available for the exchange they want. Availability was the gateway. It is closed. This closure is not announced. It is not defended. It is not explained. It is simply present. Others adjust or move on. You remain. The last illusion to fall here is the belief that power must be exercised to be real. What you have learned is that power held quietly shapes more than power displayed. Display invites contest, holding invites recalibration. You no longer need to flip dynamics. They flip themselves in your absence. You no longer need to neutralize attacks. They dissolve on contact with stillness. You no longer need to manage impressions. Impressions form and fade without consequence. This is where the doctrine shifts from behavior to state. You are not doing anything anymore. You are not applying principles. You are simply no longer available to be moved by what once moved you. And when movement stops responding to pressure, pressure disappears.